Hey guys, how are all of you beautiful people? Hope all of you are doing fine. And yes, this is a new series, Ben with Gwen. A story about how Ben and Gwen's relationship evolves over the next 4 years following their summer trip. So let's start without any delay. Let's start this great series. September, Year 1. The last day of summer vacation. Gwen tried to focus. She'd been working on her laptop for most of the drive today, which had been completely silent for the past hour. Normally she'd have to deal with Ben's antics and find a way to work through the annoyance, but he'd gone to sit up front with their grandfather after their last verbal sparring match. From superhero back to plain old super geek. Have fun back at school. Well, there is one good thing about my school. What? You don't go there? Ben hadn't even given her a chance to come up with a comeback. The doofus had just declared himself the winner and run away. So him. That's what must be bothering me. As much as Gwen hated to admit it, she could be just as immature as Ben. She hated when he got the last word, even when they were just trading meaningless insults like they had been an hour ago. But I've got to get this done, so stop thinking about him. Since school would be starting up again tomorrow, Gwen was busy making her schedule for the first month. But progress had been slow for the past hour. She'd figured out the first week flawlessly. She had it packed with activities, like her karate classes, and she left plenty of time for homework. She might only be in 5th grade, but she knew not every teacher will be lenient just because it's the beginning of the year. And she'd figured it all out while fending off Ben. But as soon as Ben got up and left the table, it was like he'd stolen her productivity and taken it with him. She was still trying to plan out her second week, and she kept second-guessing herself. What if I have to do more homework on Thursday because there's probably gonna be more assignments due Friday? And what if karate goes over a bit on Wednesday, and mom's late to pick me up, and then there's traffic? I could be late for tutoring. And of course, the clever quips and witty jabs she could have made at Ben kept popping into her head. Every few minutes, she had another "that's what I should have said" moment. Gwen groaned. She turned in her seat to glare at the back of Ben's headrest. He's probably sitting up there with that smug look on his stupid face. Gwen turned to sit back in her seat. Doofus, she said under her breath. I shouldn't have said that. Ben thought that to himself for the 50th time. He glanced over to the driver's side to make sure his grandfather wasn't looking at him. Ben had been trying to keep up a fake smile or a blank face, but he knew he looked guilty every time he had that thought. He hated guilt, and the only thing worse than feeling guilty is someone else pointing out that he felt guilty. He could hear his grandfather's voice in his head already. Now Ben, it's your last day of summer vacation. You should try to be nicer to your cousin. Who knows how long it'll be until you get to see her again. Shut up, Grandpa. His inner voice yelled at his other inner voice. He glanced nervously at his grandfather again to make sure he hadn't suddenly developed the ability to read minds. After the summer they'd just had, you never know. This is all Gwen's fault. That's what Ben thought. Of course he did. He didn't expect his joke to be the end of that match. Usually Gwen could keep up a volley of insults for way longer than that, but for some reason she'd just sat there with a weird look on her face, like she'd actually been hurt by one of his insults for once. That's not how it's supposed to work. Not knowing how to react, Ben had gotten up and gone to sit up front. And now here he was, trying too hard to act like nothing was bothering him. He knew his grandfather could tell though, he always could. But Ben was hoping his grandfather would just assume he was upset about summer ending. Ben hated school, and that was no secret. He dreaded the end of summer every year. This year was no different, except he dreaded it even more. Back to school. Back to total normal, boring Bellwood. No more crazy adventures, no more going hero, and no more Gwen. Had he said that thought out loud, he'd have turned that into a joke, like, well, that last one ain't so bad. But for some reason, that part of it was as depressing to him as the rest of it. And that shouldn't be. Dweeb, he muttered to himself. When they arrived in Bellwood, Max pulled up to the curb outside Ben's house. The three of them exited the rust bucket and stood on Ben's lawn. Max and Gwen stood side by side, facing Ben. "I want you to know," Max said, kneeling down to Ben's level. "This summer may not have turned out the way I planned, but I wouldn't have changed a single second of it." Gwen scowled. "I would have." "Me neither," Grandpa Ben said earnestly. "Thanks." He smiled and gave Max a hug. "Thank you," Max said. "You gave this old plum a new life." He stood up. "It was an honor fighting side by side with you, Benjamin Tennyson." Max held out his hand. Ben placed his bag on the ground and shook his grandfather's hand. "Hey, you weren't so bad yourself," he said. All of a sudden, Ben was tackled from behind. His dog had spotted him and came running. Ben lay on the ground, laughing in pure joy as his dog stood on top of him. Having noticed their arrival, Ben's parents came outside to greet them. "Ben!" his mother called out to him, running across the lawn to give him a way too tight hug and a way too embarrassing in front of Gwen kiss. His father walked over and knelt down to give him a hug as well. Hey, Dad," Ben's father said awkwardly, standing up and turning to face Maximum. "Son." "Good to see you," Max said, shaking his son's hand. Ben had always noticed his father and grandfather never seemed that close. Now that he knew about Max's secret life that not even his children knew about, he was beginning to understand why. The thought worried him, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his cousin's voice. "Hey, Uncle Carl. Aunt Sandra." Gwen ran past Ben to greet his parents. "Hi, Gwen," Ben's mom said, giving her niece a hug. "Now I know you and Ben have had your differences." Sandra put her hand on Gwen's shoulder, "but I hope his personality grew on you this summer." Ben's parents had always wished the two of them could get along better. "I suppose one or two of them weren't all that disgusting," Gwen smirked, turning her head towards Ben, who turned his head away from her in annoyance. Ben's parents gave each other a confused look, the reference to Ben's Omnitrix aliens lost on them. After a little more small talk, Max said it was time for him to take Gwen home before climbing back into the rust bucket. As Gwen followed him, Ben stopped her. "So, I guess I'll..." Ben began. "Smell you're around," Ben and Gwen said in unison. "I'd say I'll miss you but, Gwen started. "I wouldn't wanna lie," they said together. The two of them shared a smirk, one of the most vaguely friendly moments the two of them had had all summer, before Gwen climbed aboard the rust bucket as well. She had a serious look on her face as she considered that moment she and Ben had just had. Did that mean anything? As her grandfather drove away, Gwen went to the back of the rust bucket and pushed the curtains on the back window aside. She saw Ben still standing on the sidewalk in front of his house. She was surprised. She'd expected him to have gone inside by now. The two of them made eye contact. It was hard to tell from this distance, but Gwen saw Ben give her a small smile and a nod, which she happily returned. Ben stood on the sidewalk for another minute until the rust bucket was long out of sight. His smile slowly turned into a frown, and he hung his head glumly. "You all right, son?" Ben heard his father ask him. He'd forgotten they were there. Yeah, he said, turning to walk towards his front door. He wasn't sure why he was suddenly feeling down, so he tried to hide it with a vague smile as he and his parents entered the house. Like Ben, Gwen had remained standing in place, looking out the back window, long after her cousin was out of sight. The look she and Ben had shared just a few moments ago was captivating. Did that mean anything? She wasn't sure why exactly Ben had smiled at her and given her a nod like that, but for some reason it had made her happy. Still smiling, she made her way to the front of the rust bucket and sat down in the passenger seat next to her grandfather. "That happy to be rid of him, huh?" Max jokingly asked, noticing her smile. "What? Oh, yeah." Totally. Gwen gave a forced laugh and tried to avoid eye contact. She wasn't sure if she'd ever sounded less convincing in her life. When they arrived at Gwen's house, Gwen and Max stepped out of the rust bucket. Just like he'd done with Ben, Max gave Gwen a few parting words on her front lawn. "Gwen, I know this summer was even more different from how you planned it, but I hope your cousin and I managed to at least make it fun for you," too, Max said. Gwen had mixed feelings. 1,000 flashbacks tore through her mind at once. Some of them scary. Some of them infuriating. But some of them, pleasant. She smiled softly. "It was fun, Grandpa," she said sweetly. "And I'm really glad I could be there for it." She stepped forward and gave her grandfather a hug. "Well, I'm glad, Gwendolyn Tennyson. And even though he might not say it, Ben was glad to have you with us, too," Max said. Gwen had some even more conflicted thoughts about that. Was he? "Now, let's bring your stuff inside. You must be dying to see your parents again after all this time." Max grabbed several of Gwen's bags and carried them to her front door. Gwen rang the doorbell and opened the door. "Mom, Dad. I'm home," she called out as she and her grandfather entered. There were footsteps down the hall, and Gwen's parents came around the corner. Gwen. "Welcome back, honey," Gwen's father greeted her. "Welcome home, dear," her mother said. Gwen walked up to them and gave them both a hug. "Hello, Dad. How nice to see you," Frank greeted Max amicably, shaking his hand. "Good to see you too, son. Thanks again for taking Gwen with you on such short notice," Natalie joined in, also giving her father-in-law a handshake. "I hope it wasn't too much trouble." Gwen tensed up a little at her mother's words. She looked up at her grandfather. "It was no trouble at all. We were thrilled Gwen was able to join us this summer. In fact, I hope she can make it again next year," Max said. After another minute or two of small talk, Max decided it was time to head out. Gwen's family said their goodbyes and saw him out the door. Then Gwen and her parents grabbed her bags and carried them upstairs to her room. "All right, then. Is that everything?" Frank asked, placing Gwen's stuff on the floor. "Yep. Thanks, Dad," Gwen said. "Frank, would you mind getting dinner started?" Natalie asked her husband. "Sure thing, honey." He left the room and headed downstairs. Gwen was now alone with her mother. "Well, Gwen?" Natalie asked. "How did your summer turn out?" Gwen blinked. She knew there was a lot she couldn't tell her mother, but hopefully she wouldn't ask for too many details. "It was great, Mom," she said with a grin. "Good to hear," Natalie said. "And how was Ben?" Gwen hesitated again, staring into her mother's eyes. There was a lot she could say about Ben after that summer, and also a lot she shouldn't say. I think he's certainly changed a lot," she said. "And I'm glad I went with him." Natalie nodded. "Good. Very good. Well, unpack your things and get ready for dinner. You have school tomorrow, so make sure to get started on your schedules." Gwen nodded. "Okay, Mom." Natalie left the room and Gwen began to unpack. "Thanks, Mom." October, Year 1. Grey Matter put his pencil down and stood on the desk triumphantly. Perfect timing too, because the Omnitrix chose that moment to start beeping, indicating it was about to time out. Ben jumped back into his desk chair just in time to turn back into himself. He lifted up the piece of paper that had his homework on it. As he read it, none of it made sense. A few seconds ago, it had all been so clear to Grey Matter. The hardest part was holding the pencil, which was almost as big as he was. Ben smirked. "Pfft, whatever. Not like my teacher can tell I don't know what the heck I'm talking about." But after a moment, his smirk faded. He knew exactly what Gwen would say to that. "If you don't understand it, you're not really learning anything. And besides, it's cheating. And Grandpa told you not to use the Omnitrix, it could be dangerous." "I know." Ben groaned to himself, leaning back in his chair. Then he shot up straight. "Wait, what? What do I care what the dweeb would think?" He stood up and started pacing. "And it's not cheating, I'm not having someone else do my work, I am Grey Matter. And dangerous. I live for dangerous. I did dangerous all summer." Ben stopped pacing and sat back down at his desk. He stared at the finished homework in front of him. "It's finished. I can do whatever I want now," he said to himself. He turned in his seat, eyeing a stack of comics he hadn't read yet. But he kept sitting there, and turned back to stare at that piece of paper. He sighed, picking it up, crumpling it into a ball, and tossing it into the trash can. Then he grabbed a new piece of paper and got started again, but as himself this time. "I hope you're happy, dweeb," he said under his breath. Over at her house, Gwen wasn't having the easiest time with her homework either. She didn't get why she was having trouble reading through this textbook. It was a subject she loved, and it wasn't like the wording was too advanced for her or anything. But every time she started reading, by the end of the paragraph, her mind had drifted off again. She was never gonna get through it at this rate. She leaned back in her chair and clasped her hands to her head exasperatedly. After a few moments, she leaned forward again and looked back at the textbook. She wasn't reading it this time, just looking at it. Then she smiled as an idea came to her head. With a few hand movements, a blue disk of magic formed beneath the textbook and lifted it into the air. "Heads up!" she shouted, turning to launch it at Ben. Her smile faded instantly when she came back to reality. She wasn't in the rust bucket. She was in her room. Alone. "Ah!" she screamed in frustration. Her magic disc disappeared, dropping her textbook to the ground. She threw herself onto her bed, turned onto her back, and stared at the ceiling. This had been happening a lot since she'd gotten back home. She just kept thinking about last summer. It's what kept popping into her head whenever she tried to read that textbook. She used to love school. It's why Ben started calling her dweeb, and why everyone else would call her a geek or a nerd. This time last year, she'd have been flying through that textbook, no problem. But now, after everything she'd been through during the summer, school just seemed so boring. She didn't like that thought. That sounds like something Ben would say. Ben, she said in a ticked-off voice. That jerk. Him and his stupid watch. Why'd the doofus have to go and make summer so fun? The frustration in Gwen's face was quickly replaced by embarrassment. She sat up and looked around her room, irrationally afraid that someone might have heard her admit that. Satisfied no one did, she collapsed back into her bed with a long exhale. She needed to relax. But I still have to do my homework. Wordlessly, Gwen climbed out of bed and sat back down at her desk. She managed to get through a paragraph and a half before she started daydreaming about her and Ben kicking Characaster's butt. Ben had managed to turn in what he hoped was a satisfactory homework assignment. At the very least, he'd answered every question. He just didn't think most of them were answered correctly. He wished the teacher could give him a little extra credit as a reward for playing fair rather than using his alien superpowers to turn into a genius. But he guessed they didn't have a policy for that at his school. Most of September's assignments had been easy enough, since they were mostly review of last year's material to shake the rust off after summer vacation. But this month was suddenly much harder. His teacher told his class that it was to prepare them for middle school, which would be much more difficult than elementary school. Of course, then middle school would be harder to prepare you for high school, and high school would be harder to prepare you for college. Ben thought that was stupid. Everything was just preparation, and he wasn't even sure what they were trying to prepare him for. When Ben got home from school that day, he dropped his backpack on the floor and immediately went to play video games. He had more homework to do, but as long as he could do it later, he didn't want to do it now. This kept him occupied for about a half an hour, but even though he normally loved the game he was playing, he found himself quickly growing bored of it. Something about it was just lacking. He wasn't sure what was wrong. He'd played it all the time in the Rust Bucket last summer. He was even able to beat Gwen most of the time. Gwen. Ben leaned back in his seat and put down his controller. Maybe that was it. Maybe the single-player mode was just lame. He still had an extra controller. He could just call Gwen and see if she wanted to come over. Ben pulled out his phone and opened Gwen's contact, but then he hesitated. He realized it had already been nearly a month since he and Gwen had gotten home from their summer trip, and they hadn't so much as texted each other since. What do I even say to her? He couldn't just invite his cousin over to his house, could he? Even though they lived in the same town, he usually only saw her during family gatherings. Last summer was an exception. It didn't mean they were just going to start hanging out now, did it? After all, if she'd wanted to, wouldn't Gwen have asked to hang out with him by now? Ben scoffed at himself for even having this idea. He could imagine what Gwen would say if he called her now. That's it. You want me to come over to your house to play video games with you? What? Do you not have any friends? Ha ha ha, what a loser. Ben put his phone back in his pocket. He sat there for a few minutes, thinking he might change his mind and just do it anyway. He stared at the pause screen on his TV for a bit. When he decided he didn't want to play anymore, and he was sure he wasn't gonna invite Gwen over, he got up and turned the game off. Guess I'll do my homework. Ben dreaded it, but he had nothing better to do. So he brought his backpack to his desk, sat down, and pulled out his workbook. The first assignment he had written down was for math. He took a look at the problems. The first one was kind of simple, and he managed to figure it out. But the next one just seemed impossible. He tried skipping it and moving on to the next problem, but it was basically the same thing. Screw this. He put his hand on the Omnitrix and turned the dial to gray matter. But right before he went hero, he stopped himself. He'd been through this yesterday. Oh, come on. He was pissed at himself for suddenly having work ethic when he could have just gotten it done with zero effort. But he let his watch arm drop to his side. He was gonna have to do this the hard way. If I can't do this as myself, and I can't do this as gray matter, then how can I do it? Ben tried to think of who he could ask for help. He went through a mental list of kids in his class, but he realized he wasn't really friends with any of them. And even if he was willing to ask them, he didn't even have their numbers. His parents weren't home either. After eliminating those options, only one other person came to mind. Gwen. Ben facepalmed. Was he really thinking of Gwen again? It was like she had a talent for ruining his life even from afar. He could already imagine what she'd say about this. That's it. You want me to help you with your homework? What, are you too stupid to do it yourself? Ha ha ha, what a moron. Ben groaned in frustration. He took another look at his homework. He'd been able to make enough sense of everything yesterday to turn in a completed assignment. If he worked at it long enough, he could do it again today. It would just take a while. He considered the option of calling Gwen again. He knew she was smart, as if she'd ever let him forget it. If he got her help, he'd surely get this done way faster. But could he give her the satisfaction of having him crawl to her for help like that? Screw it. I'll just do it myself. Gwen stared at her laptop screen. A completely blank November calendar stared back at her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but they didn't move to tap the keys. What's the point? When she thought about it, the hard limits of her schedule were already memorized. She knew what hours of what days were spent in school. She knew when she had karate. She knew when she had all her other obligations. And any other events that came up irregularly would be drilled into her head by her mother repeating it ad nauseam. Beyond things of that nature, the rest of her schedule making revolved around carving out sections of her time to devote to her homework. However, for the end of September and most of this month, she hadn't really stuck to her schedule. Granted, her schedules this year were far more shoddily made than in previous years, but they didn't even matter in the end. Sometimes she'd take so long doing her homework, the time slot would be over before she'd finished and she'd have to find more time for it later anyway. Why bother scheduling time for homework when just saying get it done whenever you have free time would be just as effective? Gwen buried her face in her hands and moaned. Have I just been wasting my time with this crap for years? The possibility was frustrating. She didn't usually doubt herself like this, especially when it came to anything relating to her schoolwork. But something was different now. She was different now. And she knew exactly who to blame for that. It's all his fault. Some of Ben's careless attitude must have rubbed off on her over the summer. Plus all the times things didn't go as planned, yet somehow worked out anyway. It all gave her the impression that plans don't hold up when faced with unpredictable reality. Ben didn't plan. If he saw a burning building, he'd change into XLR8 and charge in there to rescue everyone before most others would even be able to comprehend what was happening. Why am I smiling? Gwen forced herself to frown. She made a fist and managed to stop herself just before she slammed it onto her desk in frustration. The doofus had somehow managed to creep into her thoughts once again, as he'd been doing all too often lately. Gwen sighed exasperatedly. Without another moment's hesitation, she closed out of the calendar and shoved her laptop away from her. Then she pulled out her notebook to get started on her homework. You win, Ben. I won't plan. I'll just do it. November, Year 1. 2 months into 5th grade, and Ben was already doing poorly. He had never done particularly well in school, but this year his grades were abysmal. What's worse was he knew he could just change into grey matter at any time and start acing his homework, but he still felt the need to avoid doing that because he knew Gwen and his grandfather wouldn't approve. Part of him thought he was being stupid. He hadn't even seen either of them since the last day of summer. But he followed through with his decision nonetheless. His situation with bullies hadn't improved at all this year either. He wasn't in the same class as JT or Cash, but he'd end up trading insults with them in the hallways several times throughout the week, usually loud enough and with enough foul language for the nearest teacher to come running and break them up. He hated those two, and their feud reached a breaking point one morning. He was walking to school, and a small distance from the front entrance, he saw them picking on a kid near some trees. They shoved the kid to the ground. Cash held out his hand, demanding the kid hand over his money. When he refused, JT kicked him. Seeing the bullies treating some poor, defenseless kid like that set Ben off. Since the summer ended, he'd never wanted to go hero as much as he wanted to right then. Instead he clenched his fists and walked up to them. Hey! Leave him alone! He shouted as he approached them. Hearing him, the bullies turned to face him. Heh, great! It's the hero again! Cash taunted. What's the matter, you wanna end up hanging from a tree again? With the bullies no longer paying attention to him, the kid they'd been shaking down got up and ran for the school. I am so sick of you two, Ben said in a low, angry voice. Yeah. So what? You expect us to be afraid of a little shrimp like you? JT said. No, I expect you to be the same morons you've always been, Ben retorted. Why, you little Cash took a step forward and tried to shove Ben. Not budging an inch, Ben grabbed Cash's arm, headbutted him in the chin, and pulled his arm hard enough for him to stumble forward and fall down. Hey, you can't, JT started, but an angry look from Ben shut him up. Ben took a few steps towards him and raised his fist. And that's when a teacher shouted for them to stop. Startled, Ben looked over and saw the kid who'd ran away from them standing there with a teacher. He'd run to get help. Stupid tattletale. The four of them ended up in the principal's office. Since none of this was new behavior for JT and Cash, they ended up with their usual punishments. Ben, on the other hand, was told he needed to start meeting with the school guidance counselor. Since the fight technically hadn't happened on school grounds, they weren't going to suspend him. But since fighting was the latest event in a string of bad behavior from him, he was told he needed help working out his anger issues. Unsurprisingly, being told that made him angry. Ben's first meeting was after school that day. He sat in a chair across from the woman who let him in, his arms crossed defensively and his eyes refusing to meet hers. Hello, Ben. I'm Susan, and I'll be your guidance counselor for the time being, the woman introduced herself. Ben said nothing, and still refused to look at her. I don't blame you for being upset, Ben. But try not to think of this as a punishment. I'd like to help you, if I could. Still nothing from Ben. How old are you, Ben? 30. Susan chuckled. Then I'm 20. Ben didn't seem amused. Do you have any brothers or sisters, Ben? Susan asked. What does that have to do with anything? Ben asked. It's only a question. I would like to get to know you a bit better. Ben sighed, but didn't answer the question. He wasn't any more cooperative for Susan's next few questions either. To him, this was just another dumb thing his school was forcing him to do. They can force him to show up, but they can't force him to participate. What made you want to hit your friends today, Ben? Susan asked, deciding to cut to the chase. They're not my friends, Ben responded. Okay, your classmates. JT and Cash. I've been told you've been fighting with them a lot lately. And they're not the only ones. It seems you've been having problems getting along with some other students too, and several teachers as well, Susan said, looking through a folder. Ben didn't have anything to say to that. Ben, has something been bothering you lately? Again, no response. Are you not getting along with your new teacher this year? Are you having trouble with a certain subject? Do you miss someone? Ben looked at her when she asked that last question. He quickly looked away again, but it was enough for her to know her suspicion was accurate. As far as his file showed, there hadn't been any recent deaths in his family. It must be something a bit lighter. It's not unusual to get angry and lash out at others when you become separated from someone you care about. Who is it, Ben? Did a friend of yours move away? She asked. No. It's nobody. I don't miss anybody. Ben snapped. That's all right, we don't have to talk about it now, Susan said, holding up her hands. But the point of these meetings is to help you, Ben. I think we can end here for today. Maybe we can talk a little more about this at our next meeting. Whatever, Ben said. He stood up and left, slamming the door on his way out. Gwen. 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 Emily's voice shook her out of her daydream. She'd been sitting at her desk, staring out the window. She hadn't even noticed the class had ended. Oh, sorry, Gwen said, I was just thinking about something. You working on some big side project outside of school or something? Emily asked. No, why? I've just never seen you not paying attention in class so much. Gwen felt a tinge of shame at that. Emily had been in Gwen's class every year since kindergarten, although they didn't really hang out all that much. Emily was wheelchair-bound and Gwen wasn't great with instruments, so their hobbies of karate and piano were never something they could share. But Emily was a nice person, and probably the closest thing Gwen had to a friend, even if they only talked to each other in school. So, what's going on? Emily asked in a casual but clearly concerned tone. It's nothing, Gwen said. I was just thinking about something that I did this summer. Oh. You said you went on a trip, right? Emily asked as Gwen gathered her stuff and the two of them started to leave the classroom. Yeah. Road trip with my grandpa and my cousin, Gwen said. She was trying to make it sound like no big deal, but she smiled despite herself. Sounds neat, Emily said. Yeah. It was. A 78. Gwen's mother was shocked. Gwen had hoped to keep the grade she got on her last quiz a secret, but as always, her mother eventually confronted her about it. Gwen sat on her bed and put her face in her hands, ready for the shaming to start. What happened? Natalie asked. Nothing. It was just a tough quiz is all, Gwen defended herself. Gwen, that's no excuse. You only get tough quizzes, her mother said. It's not even that bad. It's a little above the class average, even. And there are lots of these quizzes. It's no big. I wanna know how this happened. You should be studying plenty for these quizzes. Have you been following your schedules? Gwen didn't say anything and didn't look up. Her mother narrowed her eyes at her. Gwen. I haven't been making them lately, Gwen admitted weakly. What? Her mother shouted. Last summer didn't follow my schedule at all and it turned out fine. Gwen retaliated immediately. Natalie put her hands on her hips and exhaled angrily. That sounds like something your cousin would say. Gwen looked up at her with fury in her eyes. She knew she spoke the same way about Ben, but something about the disgust in her mother's voice really bugged her. So what if it does? She asked, matching her mother's aggressive tone. Natalie met her gaze with confusion. Gwen always got angry when people compared her to her cousin, but usually because it was insulting to her. The way Gwen said that, it sounded more like she was angry because it was insulting to him. Gwen, I'm very disappointed in you, her mother said. Yeah, what else is new? Gwen responded, immediately regretting it. Natalie did not like her daughter's attitude, but she chalked it up to her just being upset by her performance in school. Gwen was very studious and very competitive. She didn't take these things in stride. Just promise me you'll work harder, okay? You start middle school next year. You can't start letting your grades slip like this now. I know, Mom. And I will. I promise, Gwen said. Her mother nodded and left the room. Gwen lied down on her bed, exhausted. I do not sound like Ben, she said into her pillow. December, year 1. It was about a week before Gwen's birthday when her father knocked on her bedroom door. Gwen invited him in. Hello, Gwen. Everything going all right? Her father asked in his friendly, mild-mannered tone. Yes, Daddy. I was just studying, Gwen responded. That's good to hear, Frank said. I was just talking to your Aunt Sandra earlier today. She was wondering if you and Ben would like to celebrate your birthday with the family again this year. I told her you'd probably prefer to spend it with your friends if given the choice, but I figured I'd ask anyway. Gwen froze. Ben. In the past, they'd usually celebrated their shared birthday together, even though they both hated having to share anything with each other, let alone something as big as a birthday party. Now she was being given the option to celebrate with her friends. That would have been great, but she didn't really have any friends. She had Emily, sort of, but they definitely weren't close enough for a two-person birthday party. That would just be crazy awkward. Plus, she'd hate to have to admit to her parents that she didn't have any friends. Gwen considered all of that. If given the same option last year, she would have been depressed about her circumstances, and begrudgingly chosen to share her party with Ben. But for whatever reason, the thought didn't even bother her. It genuinely felt like a better option, rather than the lesser of two evils. No, it's all right. We can celebrate my birthday as a family. I don't want to make a big deal out of it or anything, Gwen told her father. She still couldn't bring herself to admit the idea appealed to her in the slightest, so she tried to play it off as no big deal. Family it is, then. Splendid. I was hoping to be there when my big girl turned 11, Gwen's father said. Dad. Gwen moaned, mortified despite no one else being around. Frank chuckled and ruffled his daughter's hair. Don't worry. I won't embarrass you in front of your cousin. Much. Well, I'll let Aunt Sandra know your decision. Good night, sweetheart. Try not to stress too much over studying, he said, leaving the room. Gwen said good night to her father and put her head face down on her desk. She lay there and thought about her birthday. Our birthday. That's fantastic news. I knew she'd come around. Ben could hear his mother talking on the phone downstairs. Oh. Next he heard footsteps as his mom made her way upstairs. She opened his door without bothering to knock. Good news, Ben. We're celebrating you and Gwen's birthday together again this year. She happily exclaimed. Oh, come on. Was Ben's only response, having suspected that's what this was about. Don't worry. I'm sure you'll both have a great time. I'm gonna go call your grandpa and invite him too. Good night, sweetie. And then she left. Ben lied down on his bed and stared up at the ceiling. He started thinking about Gwen. 3 months. It's been 3 months. It was strange. He'd spent 3 months seeing her every day, and just like that, he'd gone 3 months without seeing her at all. He had, however, certainly thought a lot about her, which he refused to admit, even to himself. And, to his surprise, he started to feel guilty. She's gonna be mad at me. 3 months and no phone calls, no texts, no nothing. But hey, she hasn't tried to talk to me either. Why's it gotta be my fault? He crossed his arms and scowled. His expression calmed once he realized he was having an imaginary argument again. I really need to stop doing that. He rolled over and sat up, taking out his cell phone. He flipped through his contacts until he got to Gwen. He stared at his phone for a second, trying to decide what to do. He closed it and put it back in his pocket, lying back onto his bed. What am I supposed to do? On the 10th of December, the day of Ben and Gwen's birthday, the Tennyson family gathered at Ben's house. Ben, Gwen, Carl, Sandra, Frank, Natalie, and Max were all there. Natalie Tennyson usually avoided doing anything with her husband's side of the family, but she was willing to put up with them to be there for her daughter's birthday. The night began with dinner, despite Ben's protests. He was eager to get to the presents and cake. Dinner was mostly boring conversation. The adults asked Ben and Gwen lots of questions about what they'd been up to since school started, which led to a lot of question dodging on their parts. Having their grandfather there was a relief though. Ben and Gwen had both been missing him immensely, and they enjoyed sharing knowing looks with him whenever they were asked about one of the places they'd visited over the summer. Ben and Gwen hadn't said a word to each other all night. Ben still hadn't figured out what to say to her after practically ignoring her for 3 months. He had some good ideas, like hey and what's up. But all of that went out the window as soon as she walked in his front door. He couldn't tell if it was guilt or annoyance, but he just couldn't talk to her. Gwen had been expecting at least a hello, but her cousin had only greeted her parents and then quickly walked away, leaving her confused. She'd actually been looking forward to seeing him for once, but it seemed like he was as unenthusiastic about seeing her as he had been before the summer. She wondered if he was mad at her for not talking to him since school started. Or maybe everything they'd been through together this summer hadn't really changed anything between them the way she thought it had. So the two of them spent dinner shooting each other nervous glances, both of them suspecting the other of being mad at them, and neither of them willing to be the first to break the silence. After dinner, Ben's mother started clearing away the dishes. So, what next, kids? Do we wanna have cake first, or do we wanna open presents first? She asked as she piled up everyone's plates. Cake, Gwen said. Presents, Ben said at the same time. They looked at each other for a second, not knowing whether to apologize or to start fighting. They settled on fighting. Cake, Gwen repeated. Presents, Ben returned. Cake, presents, cake, presents. Whoa, whoa. Calm down, you two. Max stood up and held up his arms. Ben and Gwen stopped, but they continued to glare at each other. Ben, Gwen, how about we start with the cake? Have our dessert to finish off our dinner. We can do presents right after, he suggested. I think that's a great idea, Grandpa. Gwen said, giving Ben a smug look. Whatever, dweeb, Ben said. Doofus, Gwen responded. Ben's mother passed out new plates and forks for everyone. His father cut the cake and served everyone a piece. As they ate, the adults continued talking the way they had during dinner. Ben scowled the whole time. Even though the cake was delicious, he hated when Gwen beat him like that. The fighting didn't end there either. They'd argued over who got the first slice of cake as well, and then when it was time to open presents, they fought over who got to open the first one. Both times, Max was able to intervene, suggesting they go at the same time rather than either going first. Ben and Gwen agreed, but they were both annoyed. They'd rather win than tie. As Ben and Gwen opened their presents, their grandfather asked them, Ben, Gwen, do either of you have a present for your cousin? They looked at their grandfather, then at each other, and then they both looked away at nothing in particular. For him. For her. Of course not. Why would I? What do I owe him? So lame. Max just sighed and rolled his eyes. Ben and Gwen wore the same expression, their faces scrunched up in fake irritation at their grandfather's suggestion. Neither of them wanted to admit they felt slightly ashamed. Gwen chanced a peek at Ben, who was focusing intently on opening another present. Next year. I'll get you something next year. I promise. All right. Ben shouted, holding up the present he'd just opened. It was the new Sumo Slammers video game. With a smile on his face, he turned to Gwen. Let's go play it. Right now. Oh, okay, Gwen said as Ben grabbed her hand and pulled her along to the TV where he had his game console set up. She stared at him with a blank expression, surprised by his sudden change in attitude. It was like he'd completely forgotten they'd just spent the last few hours fighting. I guess he just really likes his video games. Ben handed her a controller as he started up the game, and before she knew what was happening, they were competing in one-on-one sumo combat. Ben, who had played a lot of the previous game in the series, won the first few rounds. But after that, Gwen started picking it up rapidly, and won the next game. Yes. Take that, doofus. She gloated as Ben's character hit the ground. You got lucky. I'll win again next round, Ben declared. Dream on. I got this down now. I'm so gonna destroy you. For the next hour or so, Ben and Gwen continued to play each other in Ben's new game. The trash talking never let up. And as the kids played, the adults sat in the next room talking, occasionally looking back at Ben and Gwen when they shouted too loudly. "Well, I'm glad to see my grandkids are getting along as well as ever," Max said, half jokingly. "Yeah, this is great," Sandra began. "Ben's been in sort of a funk lately. I haven't seen him have this much fun since before school started this year." "Gwen, too," Frank said. "Her grades have been slipping this year, for the first time in a while." He turned to look at his daughter. A huge smile stretched across her face as she played the video game. "I'm glad she's having some fun for once." "Well, maybe you could bring Gwen around more often. I'm sure Ben would appreciate the company," Kyle said to his brother. Frank looked at his wife, who reluctantly nodded her agreement. "I think that's a great idea," he said. "Well, you two and Gwen are always welcome here," Sandra said. After a bit longer, Gwen's parents decided it was getting late, and went into the TV room to collect their daughter. "All right, Gwen. Time to get going. Say goodbye to everyone, now," her father said. Gwen was in the middle of a game. "Just let me finish this game. It'll be real quick, I swear. I'm kicking Ben's butt," she said, never taking her eyes off the screen. "Are not?" Ben responded. Too. Now, Gwen," her mother said, a little more sternly than her father. "Oh, all right," Gwen sighed, pausing the game and putting her controller down. She went over to her aunt and uncle and gave them each a hug when she said goodbye. She did the same with her grandfather, giving him a kiss on the cheek as well. Then, as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door where her parents were waiting, she turned to look at Ben. He'd been standing, still holding his controller, watching her. She was glad she was a good distance from him because she would have been too embarrassed to hug him, especially in front of her whole family. Instead, she awkwardly smiled and raised her hand to wave goodbye without saying a word. Ben returned the gesture, and before he could say anything, his cousin turned and left. After seeing their guests off, Ben's parents returned to the TV room to find Ben playing his game again. He had replaced Gwen's character with a CPU. "Ben, how much longer do you plan to keep playing?" "It's pretty late as it is," his mother said. "I can't stop now, Mom. I have to practice so I can beat her next time." By their last match, Gwen was getting very good at the game. He wanted to be able to beat her every time. Ben wasn't above taking advantage of the fact that she didn't own the game so he could practice more than she could. "Well, I'm glad you had so much fun playing with your cousin tonight. You can have her over any time you like, you know," Ben's father said. Ben glanced at his parents and quickly turned back to the game. "I didn't say I wanted her over here again." His parents smiled at each other and shook their heads. As they turned to leave, Ben said, "Well, maybe once or twice. But just so I can kick her butt again." Frank Tennyson looked in his rear-view mirror as he drove. Gwen was in the back seat, laying across the seats. She wasn't asleep, but her eyes were closed and she had a content smile on her face. Frank was happy to see his daughter like this. She'd been looking so stressed this year. He figured it was probably from school ramping up the workload to prepare her for middle school. It must have been hard on her. But at this moment, she looked so relaxed, like she didn't have a care in the world. "Did you enjoy your birthday, Gwen?" Frank asked. Gwen nodded and opened her eyes. "It was great. Thanks, Dad." "Thanks," she said to her parents. "Even with Ben there?" Frank asked. Gwen shot up straight in her seat. He was the worst. He had to fight me over everything, like always. Like, would it be killed him to wait 5 more minutes to open presents? You sure seemed to enjoy it when he shared his new video game with you, Frank countered. Gwen looked down at her feet and shifted around in her seat. Well, he wasn't all bad, she said quietly. Frank chuckled. Well, don't worry. You and him can play more in a few weeks when we see him for Christmas. Pfft. Great. Gwen flipped her hair in annoyance. Frank worried that his daughter was actually upset. But just a few minutes later, he checked his rear-view mirror again. Gwen was back to laying down in the seat, eyes closed, with that same content smile on her face. About a week after her 11th birthday, Gwen was in class. She hummed quietly to herself as she wrote down everything her teacher said. For some reason, she'd been loving her teacher lately. Everything she said was helpful and interesting to her. At the end of class, Gwen's teacher passed back the quiz she'd given the day before. Gwen slowly turned it over, worried about what grade she might see on it. Then she remembered she'd answered every question on it confidently when she'd taken it, and flipped it over. The top of the page was marked 100%. Yes. Gwen smiled and did a fist pump. Great job, Emily said, wheeling up next to Gwen's desk. She hadn't meant to peek at her grade, but since it was a good grade, she figured Gwen wouldn't mind. Thanks, Gwen said. You getting lunch? Let's go, Gwen said, grabbing her stuff and standing up. Someone's in a good mood today, Emily commented. It seemed strange, given how bored or even sad Gwen had seemed this year. She figured it was because of the 100. Acing a quiz would lift anyone's spirits, especially a bookworm like Gwen. Sure, Gwen replied. This week was going great. Way better than the rest of the year had been. The only explanation she could come up with was that she'd been thrown out of the loop by her incredibly weird summer. It had simply taken her a while to readjust, and now she was finally getting back into the swing of things. I'll be back to the top of the class in no time. So, how have you been recently? Ben's counselor asked him. Ben still hated having to go to these sessions. He sat with his arms crossed and gave an unhelpful answer, fine. That's good to hear. Better than usual? Susan asked. About the same, Ben answered. Now Ben, I spoke with your teacher earlier today, and she tells me your attitude has significantly improved in the last week. In fact, she said you even asked her a question in class yesterday. You don't usually do that, it seems. And more than that, you've been friendly to all your classmates. Ben put on his best I really wish I weren't here right now face. Why do you feel the need to hide that from me? She asked him. Ben didn't have an answer. I know you don't like being here, but if you've had a positive change in your life recently, wouldn't it feel nice to share it? I don't know what you're talking about, Ben said. Susan held back a sigh. Then she had an idea. Your birthday was last week, wasn't it? She asked. Ben cracked a smile, but quickly hid it. Yeah, he offered simply. Did you have a good birthday? Ben hesitated. It was lame, he said. Oh. Why's that? My birthday is 2 weeks before Christmas, so I never get a lot of presents. That's a shame. But I'm sure you got something you like. Well, yeah. I got this new video game I wanted. This was good. He was answering her questions. Since this seemed to be something he was willing to talk about, Susan decided to keep asking about his birthday. What game was that? The new sumo slammers game, Ben said, cracking a smile and not bothering to hide it anymore. Cool. Is it fun? Yeah. Me and my cousin played it for hours. It was awesome. Ben's counselor was looking at him with an interested smile. He realized he must have been talking really enthusiastically. His smile, which had widened considerably, shrank again. Then he realized his other mistake. The game was awesome, not playing it with my cousin. Susan had a hunch this cousin of his might have been the person he claimed not to be missing at an earlier session. Do you see your cousin very often? Or just on holidays? Ben scowled and fidgeted in his chair. Just holidays, I guess. So this was the first time you've seen him in a long time. Ben corrected her, a little more forcefully than necessary. And no, I spent all summer with her. It wasn't that long ago. Still, that's 3 whole months. It must have been a tough transition for you. Spending all summer with someone, then not seeing them at all for 3 months. It's hard to get used to someone not being there, after they spent so long always being there. Ben didn't say anything. She'd basically just put into words the thoughts he'd had before, and that made everything feel weird. He scratched his head nervously and started looking around the room a lot. What's your cousin's name, Ben? She asked. Ben looked her in the eyes and hesitated. Looking away, he answered, Gwen. Ben and Gwen, huh? His counselor said, smiling. That's funny. Ben rolled his eyes. Tell me about Gwen, she continued. She's the worst, Ben said quickly. What do you mean? She asked. From the way Ben had tried too hard to make it clear it was his new game he enjoyed, and not his cousin, she was expecting him to say something like that. She's annoying. She's bossy. She thinks she knows everything. And she hates me, Ben said. I'm sure she doesn't hate you, Ben. Sure, family members are bound to get on your nerves once in a while, but she still came to your birthday party, didn't she? Only because it was her birthday too, Ben countered. You have the same birthday? She asked. Ben nodded. Is she older or younger than you? We're the same age, Ben said. So you two were born on the same day. That's a pretty special thing to share with someone. Ben said nothing to that, so she continued. Are you going to see her again on Christmas? Yeah, Ben said. That's great. Are you looking forward to seeing her again? No. Ben denied it immediately, then quickly averted his gaze again. His face turned red, and he started scratching the back of his neck. It looked like he instantly regretted saying that. Susan wasn't convinced that Ben was opposed to seeing his cousin again. He seemed much more willing to talk about her than anything else. But at the same time, he was even more prone to irritability than normal when he talked about her. Their relationship must be pretty complex. But still, this is progress. I think we should meet again sometime after the holiday break, okay? Susan said, dismissing Ben. Ben nodded, his face still red with shame. He got up and left without another word. Christmas Eve. Ben's parents were hosting the Christmas party this year. Most of the Tennyson family was invited, as well as a number of Carl and Sandra's friends. Gwen and her parents were invited too, of course, although unsurprisingly Gwen's mother made an excuse not to come. Gwen loved her mother, but she resented the way she seemed to look down her nose at the Tennyson side of their family. Gwen knew the Tennysons were good people, even if some of them could act like jerks sometimes. As soon as her father pulled up to the curb, Gwen hopped out of the car and practically ran to the front door of Ben's house. But when she got there, she stopped, thinking. It hadn't been long at all since she'd last been here, a mere 15 days ago on her birthday. For the first time since then, she considered whether or not she'd left on good terms with Ben. Sure, they had fought over everything all day, but then they played video games together. They even waved to each other as she left. Or did they just do that because their parents and Max were there? You can just go right in, honey. They're expecting us. Gwen snapped out of her thoughts when her father caught up to her. She opened the door and stepped inside. Gwen's Uncle Carl and Aunt Sandra greeted them almost immediately. Then Gwen took a moment to scan the area. Music was playing a bit louder than Gwen expected from an adult's party, and the house was much more crowded than it had been on her birthday. She saw her grandpa Max, Max's sister Vera and their brother Gordon, Gordon's wife Betty Jean, a whole bunch of extended family she vaguely knew, and some of her aunt and uncle's friends she really didn't know. Then she spotted Joel, her great-uncle Gordon's son, and his wife, Camille. Camille the sludge puppy. There's an alien in Ben's house. Gwen freaked. She wasn't scared of Camille, since she knew she was a friendly alien. What she was more concerned about was her dad and Ben's parents finding out. She quickly ran over to her grandfather. Hey, Gwen. Glad you could make it. Her grandfather jovially greeted her. Gwen didn't say anything, but instead looked at him with a wide-eyed look that signaled trouble. Without looking in their direction, she tilted her head towards Joel and Camille. Max looked over at them and got the message. Oh, no need to worry. Max bent down and hugged Gwen, taking the opportunity to whisper in her ear. She's staying in disguise for the whole evening. No need to worry about anyone else finding out. Gwen was relieved, so she calmed down and gave her grandfather a real greeting. It's good to see you again, Grandpa. Gwen chatted with her grandfather for a little while. He wanted to know how she liked being 11 and how school and her extracurricular activities were going. Gwen answered him as truthfully as she could, but she kept looking around like she was distracted by something. Looking for Ben? Max asked. No. Gwen answered as if she were offended by the mere notion. Max laughed. He's probably with Lucy. You remember Lucy, right? Gwen gave him a dumbfounded look. Lucy, from the wedding. She said. Just how many aliens are at this party? Gwen remembered Lucy. She's the one who took her position as flower girl. Not that I'm bitter. She also danced with Ben. Not that I care. You should go see her. I'm sure she'd be happy to see you. You're family now, after all. She and Ben are in the basement, I think. Gwen nodded, excused herself, and headed for the basement like her grandfather suggested. Downstairs, she found Ben and Lucy lounging on opposite ends of a couch, holding paper plates of food they'd brought from upstairs. She wondered what they were doing down here, but figured it was just because they were the only kids at this party, other than the infants some of their other relatives had brought with them. As soon as they saw her, Lucy gasped, got up, and leaped over the couch. Gwen! She shouted, running over to hug her. Gwen was taken by surprise. Hi, Lucy, Gwen said, awkwardly returning the hug. They were family now, but still, they'd only spoken a few times at the wedding last summer. Gwen thought it was weird for the blonde girl to be this enthusiastic about seeing her. Come sit with us. You want some cake? Or some chips? We snagged a bunch before we came down here. Eat 'em before the adults notice they're missing. Lucy pulled Gwen by the hand and led her to where she and Ben had been sitting. Gwen sat in a sofa chair off to the side of the couch, both of which faced a table with a bunch of snacks on it. Lucy immediately began asking her and Ben questions about Earth stuff, as she called it. Gwen didn't even get a chance to say hi to Ben. All they'd managed was to look at each other and nod, smiling vaguely. Ooh. Ooh. What's your school like? Is it in a big building? Is it just like math and stuff, or do you have sports and stuff too? Ben didn't like the mention of school, but Gwen answered her and told her a bit about what her school was like. Was the wedding your first time on Earth? Gwen asked. No, Camille brought me when I was younger. But I'm living here now. Lucy answered. Really? Ben asked, seemingly excited at the prospect. Yeah. Well, not here, but I've been living on Earth with Camille and Joel. Gwen was surprised to hear that. Most of Lucy's family hated humans, including Camille's parents, and probably Lucy's parents too. Maybe that's why she's living with her cousin now. Neither of them get along with their parents. Gwen decided not to ask about it. The schools I saw on Earth TV are way different than my new school, so I thought maybe all your schools were different or something. But your school sounds pretty similar to mine, Gwen. What's yours like, Ben? Lucy spoke very fast. It was actually kind of hard to keep up. Ben was staring at Lucy. What? He asked when he realized he'd been asked a question. He seemed distracted by something. What you looking at? Lucy asked. Ben looked kinda embarrassed, then answered. Your eyes. Weren't they, like, blue before? Gwen looked into Lucy's eyes and saw they were violet. She hadn't noticed what color her eyes were at the wedding. Her face scrunched up in confusion. Why would Ben notice something like that? Lucy giggled a bit and gave Ben a sly grin. She leaned forward and locked eyes with him. Just can't help getting lost in my pretty eyes, huh? Ben and Gwen's faces both flushed bright red. Gwen didn't like where this was going. What the heck is she doing? Ben stuttered and looked all around the room. Lucy leaned away from him, laughing. I can make my eyes whatever color I want. I kinda went back and forth between blue or violet in human form for a while because of this human actress I saw in some old movies Camille showed me. Her eyes were always switching between blue and purple, and I just thought it was so pretty. Lucy demonstrated by blinking several times. Each time she opened her eyes, they were a different color, sometimes a color that you'd never see in a human eye. That's so cool. Ben said. Think so? Lucy said, sounding kinda proud of herself. The hair and the clothes and the rest of me I got from comic book superheroes. She said, flipping her long blonde hair as she stood up to strike a majestic pose. Then she giggled and plopped back down onto the couch. Leaning in towards Ben again, she looked at him very intently. You have really pretty eyes, too. Thanks. Ben was smiling awkwardly, not really sure how he felt about being called pretty. However, he still blushed again. Gwen thought he was acting really weird. Lucy turned to examine Gwen next. Oh, wow. Lucy got up off the couch, scurried over to Gwen, and leaned on her armrest, giving Gwen's eyes a closer look. You two have, like, the exact same eyes. She exclaimed. Gwen was a little uncomfortable. She didn't like people invading her personal space like Lucy was doing just now. She looked over at Ben, making eye contact with him. We really do have the same eyes. Ooh. I know. Lucy spun around once and struck a pose. What do you think? Her eyes had changed color again, and this time they were emerald green. The exact same shade of green that was in both Ben and Gwen's eyes. Gwen was bothered by this, but she wasn't sure why. Ben, on the other hand, seemed happy with it, which also bothered Gwen for some reason. She'd seen him look at someone else like that before, but she couldn't remember who it was. He. Lucy giggled and sat back down. Her eyes changed back to violet. I gotta keep 'em purple now, though. Camille told me if I'm gonna live on Earth, I gotta pick a look and stick with it. The three of them talked for a little bit longer. But after a while, it turned into mostly Lucy and Ben talking, and more Gwen was getting left out of the conversation. It was really starting to bother her. Ben's never that interested in talking to me. Gwen scowled at her own thoughts. Not that I care. Hey, let's go upstairs for a bit, Ben suggested. Lucy leaned over close to him like she'd done when he asked her about her eyes. Why? You wanna dance with me again? She asked with a suggestive grin. Okay, are they flirting? Gwen's face scrunched up a bit. I guess she's only related to us through marriage, but still. That's weird, right? What? Ben stuttered. Lucy hopped up onto her feet and laughed pleasantly. Only teasing. She grabbed Ben by the hand and stood him up. Then she made that same face at him again. Unless you really want to. Ben started stuttering again. Lucy laughed. You're too easy. She bounced over to Gwen and pulled her to her feet too. Come on, cause. Let's go see what's going on upstairs. Christmas music was still playing on the ground floor. Even in the rooms furthest from the speakers where it was quiet enough to actually hear other people talk, the music could still be heard. Lucy was enjoying it immensely. As they went around sampling every little snack Ben's mother had left out and talking to relatives and other guests, Lucy was dancing from room to room. Occasionally she'd pull Ben or Gwen into her dance and spin them around or something while laughing at their reactions. Gwen thought Lucy's overly energetic antics would start to wear on her, but she actually started to enjoy hanging out with her. The alien girl's upbeat attitude was infectious, and it was hard to say no to such a genuine smile. At one point, Gwen got separated from Ben and Lucy, having gotten stuck talking to one of her more boring relatives. The distant aunt, or however they were related, was going on and on about people Gwen knew absolutely nothing about, so she glanced over at the others for some help. She saw Lucy whispering something into Ben's ear, to which Lucy giggled and Ben laughed and nodded. The two of them looked over at Gwen and pointed in the direction of the stairs leading to the second floor. Then they walked off through the kitchen in that direction. Gwen wanted to know what that was about. After another minute, she managed to find an opening in her relative's story and excuse herself. She quickly headed upstairs. When she got up there, she saw no one. Ben. Lucy. She called. The music from downstairs could only faintly be heard, but she still spoke up. In here. She heard Ben call back from his room. She could faintly hear Lucy giggling as well. Ben's door was open a crack, so Gwen pushed it open as she walked in. What are you two? She was cut off by the punch bowl that fell on her head. She shrieked in surprise as she was suddenly soaked, and Ben and Lucy cracked up. Psych! Lucy shouted mid-laugh. Gwen stood in the doorway, fists clenched in anger, glaring at the two of them with fury in her eyes. Ben and Lucy kept laughing for a moment. "Man, we so got you," Ben said. "Got you good. With a classic too." Lucy joined in. She looked at Gwen with a smile, but when she saw how angry Gwen looked, her smile shrank considerably. Gwen. Are you all right? Sorry if that hurt, we were just trying to prank you." "Pfft, Gwen can't take a joke," Ben said. He chuckled a little more, but he sounded nervous. Gwen inhaled and exhaled deeply. Closing her eyes, she raised her arms and said a few words. It sounded like Latin, and her voice echoed a bit. Wait, no!" Ben shouted, shielding his face with his hands. Lucy stood there confused. A blue circle appeared above Gwen. It slowly lowered through her, reaching the ground and disappearing. Suddenly she was dry, all the punch having magically disappeared. "Oh," Ben said. He was expecting violent magical retribution, not a cleaning spell. "Wow, cool. I didn't know you could do magic." Lucy excitedly bounced towards Gwen, but Gwen turned and slammed the door on them, storming off down the hall. Back downstairs, Gwen sat in a sofa chair in the corner of the living room. The party was still going on around her, although the music had died down and some people were starting to leave. Gwen was glad nobody was trying to talk to her right now. She was mad. It wasn't the prank itself that she was upset about, not exactly anyway. It hadn't been too harmful, especially since she was able to clean herself up so easily. But she didn't like being tricked, or ganged up on, or laughed at, or humiliated, or being told that she couldn't take a joke. Ben. He always says stuff like that. And it's not true. He's just being a jerk. After sitting there brooding for a while, Gwen saw Lucy come into the room, looking around. She spotted Gwen and walked over to her. "Hey," Lucy said with a nervous smile on her face. When Gwen just stared at her angrily, Lucy sighed. "I'm sorry about the punch bowl thing, Gwen. We were just playing around. We didn't mean anything by it, I swear." Gwen nodded. "Okay. And Ben's sorry too," Lucy continued. Gwen looked at her skeptically. "I doubt it." "He is." Lucy insisted. "Did he say so?" "Well, no, but he's not sorry." Lucy didn't argue with that. "So, you wanna come back upstairs with us?" Lucy asked. Gwen just shook her head, so Lucy excused herself and headed back upstairs. Of course he's not gonna apologize. When's the last time Ben apologized for anything? Gwen continued brooding. This was nothing new. This is so like him. He does something to me, and then he acts like I'm the one who's wrong for getting mad. Doofus. She said out loud. But a few minutes later, she saw Ben and Lucy come back downstairs. She perked up and stared at them. Against everything she'd been thinking, she actually thought Lucy had convinced him to come and apologize to her. But he didn't even glance in her direction. Lucy did, and gave Gwen what looked to be an apologetic smile. The two of them sat down with Ben's parents at a table in the other room. Ben's parents wanted to get to know Lucy better. Having missed Joel and Camille's wedding, they'd only just met her and Camille for the first time that day. As they talked, Ben kept looking over in Gwen's direction, but he never made eye contact with her. Gwen honestly couldn't tell whether or not he'd even noticed she was staring at him. "Come on, doofus. Just an I'm sorry. Even a half-sincere one. Can you manage that?" But Gwen didn't get her apology. When her father told her it was time to go, they went to say goodbye to Ben's parents. Ben had disappeared to some other part of the house. Lucy, however, gave Gwen a big hug goodbye. Mm. Lucy made a strained sound as she hugged Gwen tightly. Ow. Okay, Lucy. Ow. Gwen struggled until Lucy let up a bit. Lucy giggled, but still kept Gwen wrapped in her arms. It was so good to see you again, Cause. It was great to see you again too, Lucy, Gwen said, genuinely glad the other girl had been there, despite the trouble she may have caused. We definitely gotta keep in touch. I wanna see your pretty face as much as possible, okay? Lucy went on. Gwen laughed a little at that, even though it was embarrassing. Sure, I'd like that. Let's keep in touch. After Lucy finally let her go, they exchanged phone numbers, then Gwen left with her father. As they got in their car, Gwen's father noticed she was looking a little upset. Something wrong, Gwen? He asked. Nothing, Gwen said, not even making an attempt to make it sound convincing. You and Ben have another fight. Geez, that obvious. Gwen sighed. He's such a jerk. Gwen's father continued driving and took a moment to respond. You know, after spending all summer with him, I figured you two would have had more than enough time to work out this feud you guys have. He didn't say it angrily or condescendingly at all, it was more like he was surprised that things didn't work out like that. Gwen gave a derisive laugh. As if. We fought constantly last summer. If anything, it just proved he was even more of a jerk than I thought. Gwen looked up at her father. She could see the tinge of sadness in his eyes as he stared ahead at the road. Gwen felt bad. She didn't like it when her father was upset, and he always wanted her and Ben to get along. Gwen had to remind herself that this was Ben's fault. He's the one who's impossible to get along with. Not me. Ben couldn't get to sleep. The party had ended and he'd gone upstairs to bed an hour ago, but he just laid in bed, awake and staring at the ceiling. His brow was knit and his jaw was clenched. Thoughts of the night's events nagged at him. He knew he'd screwed up. When he pulled that prank on Gwen, he really didn't think she'd get that upset. He just wanted to annoy her a little. But after she stared daggers at him and Lucy and stormed off, he knew he'd made a mistake. But Ben couldn't admit that to Gwen. He couldn't just let her win like that. That's why he couldn't apologize, even after Lucy begged him to. And that just made him feel even more guilty. He'd screwed up, and then he'd just left her to mope in the corner for the rest of the night. All he had to do was apologize, then maybe things could have been okay. He wasn't sure why he'd hidden in another room when Gwen was leaving. Maybe he knew he'd crack and apologize if she confronted him, and he still didn't want to let her win like that. Maybe he was just too ashamed to even be around her. Whatever the case, he'd let her leave without giving her an apology or even saying goodbye. He had no idea how long it would be before he saw her again. What am I supposed to say to her when I do? The thought felt familiar. It was just like before he saw her on their birthday. Ben rapidly lifted his head and slammed it into his pillow several times. This shouldn't even bother me. He yelled at himself internally. Before last summer, he and Gwen had parted ways on bad terms like this many times, usually after fights a million times worse. Some of those times he'd felt guilty, but never like this. He never worried about how long he'd have to go without seeing her, or what he was gonna say to her the next time he saw her. Ben rolled over onto his side. It's still her fault. She cleaned it up with her magic, so no problem. And it was just a joke. She needs to learn to take a freaking joke. But that thought only made him feel more guilty. Ugh! He grunted, rolling onto his back again and slamming his fists onto his bed. What is wrong with me? January, Year 1. Early January, the day after the holiday break. Back at school, Gwen was bored again. It had been more than a week since the Tennyson Christmas party. She was still vaguely mad at Ben, but she wasn't thinking about that at the moment. Instead, she found herself daydreaming about her adventures from last summer, just like she'd been doing earlier in the year. Gwen barely noticed when her teacher dismissed the class. She silently chided herself for not paying attention. Before the holidays, she'd been getting much better about paying attention in class, so she was hoping to keep that up. "Hey," Emily said as she wheeled up next to Gwen's desk. "You doing okay, Gwen?" "Yeah, why?" Gwen responded. "I don't know, you just looked kinda down." "Rough break?" Gwen hadn't realized she'd been looking glum. But after being asked about break, she felt about as bad as she looked. "You could say that," she said with a sigh. "Family, huh?" Emily said. "What?" Gwen's heart skipped a beat. She was worried she'd said something about Ben without realizing it. Emily shrugged. "Everyone sees family over the holidays. And everyone's family's crazy." Gwen smiled a bit at that. "Yeah, I guess so." She suddenly felt very uncomfortable. Gwen stood up and grabbed her stuff, walking quickly out of the classroom. In her next class, Gwen was actually able to focus through most of it, but only because she was really forcing herself to. By lunch, she felt completely drained, as if she'd had to physically exert herself just to stay focused. As she sat at her lunch table and ate, she thought over her situation. Something was clearly wrong. Focusing in school was never something she'd had to try to do before. But ever since last summer, it had been a problem. However, what Gwen really couldn't figure out was that 2-week span before Christmas break where she seemed to have gotten over her slump. She thought she'd be set for the rest of the year, but now she was right back to where she'd started. Why was this happening to her? Of course, Gwen remembered her fight with Ben over break, especially since Emily had inadvertently reminded her this morning. However, even though she'd done it a lot recently, she couldn't bring herself to blame this all on Ben. "He's a jerk, but he's not powerful enough to cause all the problems in my life, despite his best efforts." She considered a simpler explanation. She'd already blamed her slump before Christmas break on her having to adjust to being in school again after her summer break. Perhaps this was just happening again. Christmas break was fun too, so now she just had to readjust again. "Am I gonna have to do this every time I have a few days off now? Why am I suddenly so bad at school?" As she was obsessing over this, Gwen finished her lunch. It never took her very long to eat, especially when she got stuck at the end of a table full of people she didn't really know, like she had today. Everyone else always took longer because they were talking with her friends, but Gwen rarely had that problem. She sighed, standing up to go drop off her tray. She decided to use the rest of the lunch period to go start her homework in the library. With any luck, she'd be able to get some of it out of the way. Assuming I can keep my head on straight long enough. Ben sat at a table in the cafeteria as he ate his lunch alone. Like usual, no one else wanted to sit with him. He was angry, but not because of that. By now, he was used to having no friends at school. What he was angry about was JT and Cash. As he ate his lunch, he glared at the two of them as they picked on another younger kid, right there in the crowded cafeteria. Why doesn't anyone do anything? Ben felt his right hand grip the Omnitrix. Situations like this always made him want to go hero. But he couldn't. In fact, keeping in mind what happened the last time he got into a fight with those two, he couldn't even go over there and stop them as himself. The kid the bullies were picking on apparently decided to leave, since he meekly stood up with his lunch tray and tried to walk away. But the bullies wouldn't let him. JT held out his leg, causing the kid to trip. He managed to catch himself on his knees, although it looked like it hurt. His tray clambered to the ground and spilled his lunch all over the floor. The bullies laughed. Everyone else in the area just looked away, pretending not to notice. Ben stopped caring about the consequences. He stood up and walked with purpose over to the scene. Oh, great. It's JT started to say something when he noticed Ben, but he was interrupted. Ben slid his hand under J.T's lunch tray and flipped it upwards, causing it to smack JT in the face. His food splattered all over him. JT screamed in anger. Suddenly everyone in the cafeteria noticed something was going on. Many kids gasped as others turned their heads to watch the scene unfold. What the hell is your hay? Cash started to complain, but JT grabbed Cash's tray with both hands and tried to slam it into the side of Ben's head. Luckily, Ben managed to hold up his left hand and block it with the Omnitrix. He protected his head, but his arm still hurt like hell, making him yell out in pain. They were loud enough for a teacher who'd been passing by the cafeteria to step inside to investigate the commotion. The teacher saw the mess, along with Ben and JT standing there covered in lunch food. Both of them got a trip to the principal's office. Ben wasn't any happier to see his counselor this time. He'd been close to being done with her, but after this latest incident, he ended up scheduled for additional sessions. Now I'll never be done with her. Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Susan asked. Nope, I'm good, Ben said. Okay. Well, I'd like to talk about your recent fight with JT. I already told the principal everything, Ben insisted, not wanting to go over it again. I know. But I'm not investigating what happened. I'd like to know why it happened. Because JT was being a jerk to someone and he shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. You could have told a teacher. Like that ever does anything. A teacher being notified is what got you here, isn't it? Ben stared at Susan. He didn't have a comeback for that. You seem to have a lot of anger, Ben, Susan told him. Gee, I wonder why, Ben said sarcastically. Susan thought back to their last meeting. She decided to follow up on something they'd talked about. Did you see your cousin again over the holidays? Ben narrowed his eyes. Why? I'm just curious. Ben pondered this. He knew where this was going. She was gonna try to say all of his issues come from his family life or some other therapist junk. Yeah, I saw her. On Christmas. New Year's. Christmas Eve. And did you have a fun Christmas? Ben sighed. He really didn't feel like describing how he spent the holidays. It was all right. Did you and your cousin play any more of that video game you got for your birthday? Susan asked. Ben grit his teeth. No. No. Why not? We just didn't. Okay. Susan paused for a moment. Does talking about your cousin upset you, Ben? Why does it have to be about Gwen? Ben asked, frustrated. Does everything have to be about her? We have the same birthday, the same grandpa, practically the same name. Can't I have something to myself? I get into a fight with some stupid bullies and that can't even be because I wanted to. Susan was somewhat taken aback by Ben's outburst, but she maintained her composure and gave Ben a moment to calm down. I apologize, Ben, she said. I didn't mean to belittle your sense of justice. I believed you when you told me why you got into a fight with your classmate. Ben didn't seem angry anymore, but he did seem rather embarrassed for himself. He just nodded to accept his counselor's apology. But your fighting with your classmates is not my only concern. As we've said, you seem to have a lot of anger in you, and I think you're in denial when you say it has absolutely nothing to do with your cousin. If it didn't, I don't think you would have exploded like that. Ben stared at her like a deer in the headlights. Again, I apologize, Ben, Susan said. I'm not trying to attack you. But I think this is something you should take some time to think about. Okay. Ben was getting uncomfortable, and he just wanted this conversation to end. Luckily, his counselor seemed satisfied with his agreement and let him end the session there. We'll talk more about this next time, if you're ready. Ben wasn't sure what exactly it would take for him to be ready. But rather than dwell on that, he decided to just get up and leave. After all, he was only doing this because the school was making him, right? It's not like I have any real issues. February, Year 1. Ben sat on the couch watching TV late at night. He wasn't actually watching it though, just flipping through channels. It's something he'd been doing a lot recently. There were plenty of shows he used to enjoy and he had lots of video games, but he often found himself in a mood where nothing really held his interest. This, on top of the anger issues his school had told them about, worried his parents considerably. But Ben always insisted he was fine when they asked him about it. He claimed there wasn't anything wrong with him, he was just bored. Ben didn't like worrying his parents. That's why he was glad they were both busy at the moment. He could lazily flip through the channels all he wanted without either of them saying anything. But then he saw something. He went back a channel and saw a live news broadcast. A bank heist had gone bad, and now there was a standoff with the police. Ben jumped to his feet and held up his arms excitedly. Yes. Finally. He cried out. He stopped to listen for any signs that his sudden outburst had attracted the attention of his parents. Hearing neither of their voices or footsteps, Ben rushed to his room. This is great. This is amazing. Ben said to himself. Finally, a reason to go hero that not even Grandpa would disagree with. And it's a bank robbery. The classic child-friendly supervillain crime. Not wasting any time, he opened his window and climbed out. He stood still for a moment, a triumphant smile plastered on his face. He breathed in the cool night air and enjoyed the moment before lifting his left arm in front of him. With his right hand, he turned the dial of the Omnitrix, setting it to XLR8. It's hero time. He said his catchphrase, raising his hand and bringing it down on the watch. Seconds later, he was a blur as he sped towards the bank. But then he stopped. He had the nagging urge to go get Gwen. Well, it's been a while. I guess having a little backup wouldn't hurt. I mean, I could probably take em easily if it were just one or two bad guys. But any more than that might be too many, even for me. After justifying his decision to himself, he took off in another direction. Moments later, he was outside Gwen's house on the other side of town. I haven't seen her in a while. And she's probably still pissed at me. It was a thought he'd had several times this year. XLR8 sighed and tried to ignore whatever guilt he was feeling this time. He picked up a tiny pebble and threw it at her second-story window. Without meaning to, he threw it at super speed. It whizzed straight through the window, breaking a tiny hole into it. From inside, he heard Gwen shriek. "Real smooth, Ben. That'll make her happy to see you." Moments later, Gwen opened the window and leaned out. She noticed the blue alien standing on her lawn. "Ben," she said in surprise. But she didn't sound angry. And Ben couldn't see from where he was standing, but Gwen perked up and a big smile broke out across her face at the sight of him in one of his alien forms. But after getting over her initial surprise, she changed her expression to one of anger. "What the heck?" she shouted down to him. "Sorry," XLR8 said, holding up his hands apologetically. "It was an accident, I swear." "Oh, sure. You accidentally launched a rock at high velocity with pinpoint precision. What am I supposed to tell my parents when they see this?" "Look, dweeb, we don't have time for this. Bank robbery. Lucky girl. Hero time. Let's go." All right, keep your voice down. Gimme 1 second." Gwen leaned away from the window and out of Ben's sight. Moments later, she reappeared wearing her mask and the rest of her lucky girl outfit. She summoned a light blue magic disc outside of her window and stepped onto it. Slowly, it lowered her to the ground next to Ben. "So what's going on?" she asked. "I just told you. Now let's go." XLR8 lifted Gwen up and sped off. "Whoa!" Gwen shouted in surprise. She wrapped her hands around Ben and held tight, pressing her head into his chest. Moving at XLR8 speed tended to make Gwen sick. But the way he was holding her in his arms made her feel strangely safe. Before long, they came to a sudden stop. Ben was about to drop Gwen onto the ground, but he saw the way she was clutching him. "You okay?" he asked. Gwen looked up and realized what she was doing. She was glad her mask covered most of her face, because she was definitely blushing. "Yeah, I'm fine. Would you put me down already?" Gwen said, more irritably than Ben was expecting. "Have it your way." XLR8 released Gwen, letting her drop to the ground with a thud. "Ow!" Gwen stood up and brushed herself off, glaring at Ben. He just shrugged. She sighed, then looked around. Ben had stopped a safe distance from the bank, and she could see several police cars gathered in the street outside of it. "So it's some jewel thieves or something?" Gwen asked for clarification. "Bank robbers. Saw them on the news. There are news cameras here. What if Grandpa sees us?" "So what if he does?" Gwen sighed again and shook her head. "So what's the plan?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "We go in and kick some bad guy butt. You know, the usual." XLR8 struck a pose like he was about to speed off, but the Omnitrix started beeping. "Oh," he said. In a flash, he was Ben again. Gwen said nothing, but the smirk on her face spoke volumes. "Oh, shut up," Ben said. "I never get tired of that," Gwen said, still smirking. "Well, it's been fun, but it looks like the real superhero has work to do." Gwen turned away and took a step towards the bank. "Wait." Ben reached out and grabbed her hand. She stopped dead in her tracks. They both looked down at their hands. Ben had only meant to stop her from walking away from him, but the way he'd grabbed her hand, their hands were now clasped like they were about to go on a stroll together. The two of them stood there for a moment, then looked up at the same time. Their eyes met. They quickly let go of each other and turned away. I was just. No, yeah, I know. Yeah. It took them a bit to get over that awkward moment, so they focused on observing the police in the street. Ben cleared his throat. Sorry, the watch will be ready again in a sec. Then we can go fight some bad guys, he declared. Well, maybe we can use this time to actually think of a plan, Gwen suggested. Ah, fine. 20 minutes later. Everything had gone smoothly. They saved all the innocent bystanders, beat up the bad guys, and got out before the police or the press could ask them any questions. After fleeing the scene, they made their way to a secluded, wooded area of a nearby public park to stop and rest on the way home. Gwen, panting, took a seat and pulled off her lucky girl mask. Ben was out of breath too, the Omnitrix having timed out minutes ago, forcing him to run normally with Gwen. But after a few seconds, he was elated. Woohoo! Yeah! He shouted, jumping in the air and fist-pumping victoriously. Hey! Keep your voice down, doofus! Gwen scolded him. Oh, come on, Ben turned to his scowling cousin. Tell me you didn't love that just as much as I did. Finally some action, you know. Just like last summer. Gwen looked away, and smiled softly. She had enjoyed it, sort of. And it really did feel like last summer again. But that only calmed her nerves so much. Those guys had guns. They'd taken them down easily enough, but that didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. After celebrating, the fatigue caught up with Ben. He fell to the ground and propped himself up against a tree. We need to do this more often, he said. What? Gwen asked. You know, this superhero thing. I've missed it. Gwen shook her head. This can't be a regular thing. Grandpa wouldn't want us to keep doing this. Who cares? Ben asked. I care. And you should too, Gwen countered. Whatever, dweeb. Shut it, doofus. Nerd. Moron. Freak. Spaz. They glared at each other for a second. Then Ben started cracking up, giving Gwen a moment of confusion. It really is just like last summer, huh? He said, his laughter dying down. Gwen's glare softened, but it didn't go away. A dozen thoughts passed through her head. How could he be like this? We haven't said a word to each other since he played that dumb prank on me at the Christmas party. Then he shows up at my house in the middle of the night and pulls me into some superhero mission. And now he's laughing like nothing ever happened. He probably doesn't even remember it. Ben realized he was making Gwen angry again, so he stopped talking and stood up. Come on. Let's get out of here, he said. Gwen stood up and started following Ben, then she stopped. She had a strange look on her face. What's the matter? Ben asked. Your house is that way, Gwen said, pointing in a different direction. Ben looked in the direction she was pointing, then back at her. Yeah, but your house is this way. Gwen stood still and stared at him with that unusual expression on her face still. You coming or what? Ben asked. Are you walking me home? She asked. She sounded surprised and a little bit disgusted, but at the same time she sounded sort of hopeful. What? No. Ben flushed up and his eyes darted around nervously. What does she think this is, a date? I figured we could walk until the Omnitrix was ready again, and then I could go XLR8 the rest of the way, Ben quickly explained, stuttering a bit. Oh, okay, yeah, Gwen said. Ben couldn't tell what she was thinking. Not that that was anything new. They walked mostly in silence. Ben expected the Omnitrix to be ready again in a matter of minutes, but it must have needed more time to recharge from overuse. He'd used it once to get to Gwen's house and to the bank, then he'd used it again almost immediately to get into the bank and fight the bank robbers. By the time the watch was ready to be used again, Ben and Gwen had already made it back to Gwen's house. During the walk back, Ben kept looking like he wanted to say something to Gwen. A few times he started to talk, but all he ended up saying was some vague compliments about how she'd done a good job as lucky girl. She accepted the compliments, and awkwardly returned them, but she could tell he wanted to talk about something else. When they got back to Gwen's house, they stood on the lawn beneath her window. They looked at each other, not entirely sure what to say. Gwen broke the silence first. Well, I guess I'll see you around. She moved her arms, and a blue aura emanated from her hands like she was about to make another magic disc to raise herself back up to her room. Gwen, wait. Ben stopped her. What? Gwen stopped, dispelling the blue aura. Ben averted his gaze downward and nervously rubbed his shoulder. Listen, He acted very guilty as he started to talk. I'm sorry about that thing on Christmas, he finally managed to say. Gwen didn't say anything in response. Ben forced himself to make eye contact with her, and he saw her staring at him, mouth agape with shock. So, we cool? Ben continued, as Gwen was apparently speechless. Gwen managed to nod, and she smiled a little. Like before, the two continued to stand there staring at each other, saying nothing for a moment. Ben figured the apology had gone about as well as it could have, but now the moment was awkward. So, okay. Okay, cool. I guess, see you next time. Ben spoke to break the awkward silence. Yeah, see ya, Gwen answered. Ben turned the dial on the Omnitrix back to XLR8 and slammed his hand down on it. As soon as he transformed, he sped off. Gwen remained on her lawn, staring off in the direction Ben had left long after he was out of sight. Then she smiled brightly, and magically lifted herself back up to her room. March, Year 1. Ben, Gwen, and their parents sat around Gwen's dining room table. Gwen really wished her father hadn't invited Ben and his parents over for dinner. Meals like this were always uncomfortable, mostly because her mother really didn't get along with the Tennyson family. For the most part, Ben and Gwen had been silent throughout the meal. They knew better than to try to get involved in their parents' arguments. Not that they ever overtly argued. The current conversation had been going pretty well to start with, but as soon as the topic of parenting came up somehow, that's when the moms got passive-aggressive. I've always felt that putting too much pressure on a child to succeed will only end up smothering them. Sure, they might get good grades, but they'd be living in constant fear of disappointing their unpleasant parents, Sandra said, looking pointedly at her sister-in-law. Yes, well, pressure or no pressure, a child must have boundaries. Otherwise, they'll never work for anything and they'll just end up getting themselves into trouble, Natalie responded. It was obvious to everyone what they were saying. Frank and Carl remained silent and gave each other a look of shared discomfort. Ben and Gwen did the same. In fact, That's pretty much all Ben and Gwen had been doing throughout dinner. Listening to their parents talk felt like watching people walk over a minefield. The only thing that made it bearable was the knowledge that someone else was just as uncomfortable. But they couldn't take much more of this. If the conversation kept going the way it was going, their moms were only going to get worse. Ben and Gwen shared another look, one they'd shared before when dealing with hostile aliens. A look that said it's time to make our escape. Gwen cleared her throat and pushed her plate forward a little. Dad, may Ben and I please be excused? I have something that I've been wanting to show him, she said, deliberately choosing the parent more likely to say yes. Sure, run along you two, Frank said. Ben and Gwen both pushed their chairs back and stood up. They calmly walked out of the dining room together. However, as soon as they were out of sight of their parents, they practically sprinted upstairs to Gwen's room. After shutting the door, Gwen immediately collapsed onto her bed, while Ben just sat on the floor and leaned against the wall. Oh, thank God, Ben said as he breathed a sigh of relief and tilted his head back. Yeah, Gwen said. We got out of there just in time. Any more of that and I would have gone nuts. You're already nuts. Ben grinned. Shut up, Gwen giggled a bit and tossed a pillow at Ben. After a second, she spoke again. Why can't our moms just get along? What, like you and me? Ben joked. Shut up. Gwen said, laughing more this time. I mean like our dads. They get along great. Well, they're brothers, Ben said. The two of them sat quietly for a moment. Neither of them wanted to say it, but the situation reminded them of how they used to make up excuses together to get out of eating Grandpa's cooking last summer. Ben took a moment to glance around the room. From where he was sitting, he could see a box underneath Gwen's bed. What's in there? Ben asked out of curiosity, pointing at the box. Gwen looked where he was pointing. Since she was on top of the bed, she couldn't see what he meant, so she crawled to the edge of the bed and looked down. Oh! She exclaimed. She slid down onto the floor and grabbed the box, pulling it out for Ben to see. Souvenirs. Ben stood up and walked over to her. Gwen opened the box and showed him its contents. Inside, there was a lot of junk. Most of it was touristy stuff she'd gotten from the various cities and landmarks they'd visited last summer. Ben lifted up a miniature Mount Rushmore. Hey, I wonder how many people know there's a plumber base underneath that place. Ben smiled, remembering all the incredible things he'd seen there. Then he placed it back in the box. He expected a lecture from his cousin about how he should look with his eyes and not with his hands. However, she remained sitting still, holding up the box for him. She gave him a genuinely friendly smile, as if inviting him to look through them some more. Ben was a little confused, but he accepted her wordless offer and dug around inside the box again. In addition to all the regular souvenirs, he also saw some more unusual stuff. Characasta's spellbook, a tape recorder, and 2 unsealed envelopes, among other things. Ben picked up one of the envelopes. Inside it was a stack of photographs. The first dozen or so were of him and Gwen in the town of Sparksville. He remembered it as being one of the most boring places they'd visited last summer, but all the photos showed him and Gwen having fun. As he flipped through them, he saw plenty of other places he recognized immediately, including Joel and Camille's wedding. Ben looked up from the photos and saw Gwen was staring at him, looking kind of embarrassed. Ben wasn't sure why. You kept these? Ben asked, indicating the photos. Yeah, so what? Gwen responded, a little defensively. "Can I have a few of them?" Ben was almost mumbling. Gwen's expression changed from annoyed to surprised. She hadn't expected him to ask that, so she hesitated for a moment. "You know, just to, like, have something to remember those adventures by, or whatever," Ben justified. "Oh, okay." Gwen nodded. "You can actually just take that envelope. I made 3 copies of them all. Grandpa has the 3rd set." "You made copies for each of us?" Ben asked. "I forgot to give you yours." "Okay," Gwen explained, getting a little too defensive again. Gwen really had intended to give Ben the set of photos she'd copied for him as soon as she'd had them printed. However, she'd decided at the last minute not to. She thought it would be embarrassing and Ben would make fun of her for being corny or something. "It's not like I made a precious memories scrapbook or something." Ben held up his hands in surrender, trying to show he wasn't accusing her of anything. He quietly slipped the envelope into his pocket. Not sure what to say next, Ben walked over to Gwen's door and opened it a crack, leaning outside to listen for their parents' voices. "You hear anything?" Gwen asked, putting the souvenir box back under her bed. "Yeah," Ben answered. "What are they saying?" Gwen asked, hoping they weren't fighting. "I'm not sure. But I hear our dads talking, so I don't think they're fighting at least." Ben leaned back inside and closed the door. "You wanna go back downstairs?" he asked. While he was looking outside, Gwen had climbed back onto her bed and lied down. She hadn't realized how tired she was. Her day had been pretty busy, it was getting late, and dinner was somehow exhausting. Nah, Gwen declined, stretching her back to get more comfortable on the bed. She closed her eyes to rest for a second. All of a sudden, Gwen was startled by the sound of the pillow she'd thrown at Ben earlier falling beside her head. This was followed shortly by Ben crashing down on the bed next to her, bouncing her a few inches into the air. Gwen yelped. "Hey! Get your own bed, doofus!" she shouted at Ben. "Nope," Ben said, squirming a bit on the bed as he got comfortable. "I think I like it here. Way more comfortable than the floor." Gwen groaned and rolled over onto her side, keeping her back to Ben. Next to her, Ben lay flat on his back, resting with his hands behind his head and looking up at the ceiling. After a few moments of restful silence, Ben spoke. "Hey Gwen." Gwen grunted in response. "Have you ever noticed your dad sounds like Clark Kent?" Gwen rolled over and turned to Ben with a bewildered look on her face. "You think my dad is Superman?" Ben chuckled. "Please, I'm the only Superman in this family," he said, tapping the Omnitrix. Gwen laughed a bit, then lowered her head back down onto her pillow. She didn't want to fall asleep, but she was very tired. She lowered her eyelids, telling herself she was only going to rest for a minute. Then she was out. Gwen didn't want to move. She'd woken up, but her eyes were still closed, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd been this comfortable. She smiled contentedly and enjoyed the moment. It was peaceful and quiet, the only sound being that of her own breathing. Wait a minute. She heard more than her own breathing. She heard someone else's too. She opened her eyes. In her sleep, she had apparently snuggled up next to Ben, her head laying on his arm and her arm laying across his chest. Gwen sat up in a panic, scrambling out of bed immediately. She stood there staring at Ben, practically shivering with embarrassment. Was he asleep too? Did our parents come in and see us like that? Oh God! She looked at the clock on her nightstand. Thankfully, they hadn't slept for long. Their parents might not have bothered to check on them yet. Gwen decided to leave the room and head back downstairs to make sure. Gwen found her and Ben's parents sitting around in the living room, talking and laughing. They were drinking wine, except for Uncle Carl since he had to drive home. They seemed friendlier than they had at dinner, probably because of the wine. "Ah, Gwen. I was just wondering where you'd run off to," Gwen's father said as she stepped into the room. "Hi" was all Gwen said, trying to hide her nervousness. She calmed down a little when she realized that her father's reaction meant they hadn't come looking for them, so they hadn't seen her with Ben on her bed. "What have you and Ben been up to?" Aunt Sandra asked. "Nothing," Gwen answered too quickly. "Great. Now I seem guilty. It's not like we did anything. We were just talking. I showed him some of my souvenirs from the summer trip." "Ah, that's nice," Uncle Carl said. "Ooh, it's later than I thought it was. We should probably get going soon," Aunt Sandra said, noticing the time. "Gwen, would you go get Ben and tell him we need to go?" "Okay," Gwen answered. As she walked back upstairs, she wondered if Ben was still sleeping, and if it would be weird to wake him up. She wasn't sure why she thought that. She'd had to wake him up plenty of times last summer when he was too lazy to get out of bed in the morning. When she got back to her room, Ben was already awake. He was sitting up in her bed, staring at the photos she had given him earlier. "Hey," Gwen said to make her presence known. Ben looked up at her in surprise. "Ah, hey," he responded, getting up off the bed and putting the photos back into his pocket. Gwen didn't know what to make of his reaction, so she didn't say anything about the photos. "Your parents want you downstairs. You guys are leaving," she said. "Oh. Okay." Gwen thought she could hear the slightest bit of disappointment in his voice, but figured she was imagining things. Back downstairs, as Ben and his parents prepared to leave, Gwen hugged her aunt and uncle goodbye while Ben gave casual goodbyes to her parents. Then, Ben turned to Gwen and waved. "Later, dweeb. Later, doofus." Gwen returned the wave. Their parents reacted silently with various smirking and head shaking. Then Ben and his parents left through the front door. Ben sat in the back seat of the car as his parents talked up front. He wasn't really listening to what they were saying though. He was too busy looking at the photos Gwen had given him again. Why did I ask for these? He wasn't quite sure. A lot of them were of boring places like Sparksville or embarrassing places like the wedding. The Omnitrix was a much better souvenir of last summer than any of these photos, by a long shot. And yet, he couldn't stop staring at them as he slowly flipped through the stack. He felt something as he looked at the photos. Nostalgia. So many events from the summer came rushing back to him so clearly, and the only thing in the past 6 months that even compared to them was when he and Gwen had stopped that bank robbery last month. Ben's face scrunched up in disgust as he realized the time he'd spent with Gwen was the most fun he'd had all year. Back in her room, Gwen shut the door and took her souvenir box out again. Placing it on her bed, she took out the last remaining envelope of photos. Ben was looking at these. She took them out and started looking through them as well. She'd looked through them once before when she first got them developed, and she had done so again when she gave Grandpa his copies. But for some reason, she was enjoying looking through them so much more this time now that she'd finally given Ben his copies. The fact that he'd not only accepted them, but actually asked for them, also made her feel good for some reason. She held up a picture of her and Ben in Sparksville. They were standing back to back with their arms crossed. Ben wore sunglasses and fake antlers on his head and was making a serious face. Gwen had a baseball cap on and wore googly eye glasses while smiling joyfully. Gwen laughed at the photo. Doofus. April, year 1. Gwen was quite proud of herself at the moment. Lately, she'd been doing well in school once again. After a string of perfect scores on her homework assignments and more than decent grades on her quizzes and tests, she was beginning to enjoy school almost as much as she used to. She was hoping she could keep this streak going, which is why she chose to continue studying intently this evening. However, Gwen was unable to keep up her laser-sharp focus when a tiny rock shot through her bedroom window like a bullet, shattering a second small hole in it. Gwen shrieked and ducked down, shielding her head with her arms. She immediately knew the cause of the disturbance. "Bean!" she shouted before even lifting her head back up. "Sorry." She faintly heard the raspy voice of one of her cousin's aliens calling from outside. Angrily, she stomped over to her window and lifted it open. "Again? Are you kidding me?" "I'm sorry," Ben repeated. "I swear it was an accident, again." Gwen sighed. Ben was standing on her lawn as XLR8. She knew where this was going. More hero stuff. "You know it. Grab your mask and your pajamas, we've got people to save," Ben shouted up to her. Gwen shook her head. "No." "What do you mean, no? Like you got anything better to do?" Gwen stopped herself. She realized that having a shouting match with an alien on her lawn in the middle of the night was gonna attract someone's attention sooner or later. "Look, just get in here." Gwen's hands began to glow blue. With a few arm movements, a similar blue aura surrounded Ben, lifting him into the air. "Whoa, whoa, hey!" Ben was caught off guard, but he managed to undo his Omnitrix transformation and turn back into himself while he was tumbling through the air. This made him small enough for Gwen to pull through her open window. Once inside, she stopped levitating him, letting him drop to the floor. "Ow." "Sorry," Gwen said mockingly, considering it revenge for dropping her last time. Then she stepped over Ben and closed the window. Ben climbed to his feet. He was angry for a second, but he brushed it off, wanting to get straight to the point. "Look, what are you doing? We need to go. Now." "Ben." "No," Gwen repeated herself. "I'm studying right now, and I'm guessing you should be too." "Who care about studying?" Ben asked. "Lives are at stake here." "I care. And I told you last time that we can't keep doing this. It's dangerous." Gwen insisted. "But you liked it last time." "No, I liked, can't we just, Gwen stomped her foot and let out a frustrated sigh. "What?" Ben asked. He shook his head. "Look, whatever. The point is, people are in danger and we need to save them. There are other people who can do that." "Yeah, but we can do it better." "Ben." "Gwen, it's just a burning building." Ben insisted. "There aren't even any bad guys this time, I swear. And if you don't wanna go in there, fine, but can't you at least stand outside and use your magic to move people to safety? Or catch me if I fall?" Gwen was about to refuse again, but she hesitated. She looked Ben in the eye and pictured him trying to pull off some stupidly dangerous stunt while rescuing others. "If I'm not there to help him, he could get hurt." "Fine," she agreed. "Yes. Thanks, Gwen. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for the people in the building, Gwen insisted, walking over to her closet where she kept her lucky girl costume. She opened the door, pulled the costume off the rack, and stepped back. She stopped and glared at Ben. Well, what? Ben asked. Get out, doofus. I don't want you watching me change. You, gross. I don't wanna do that either. Ben hurried to the bedroom door and opened it. I'll just meet you outside, he said as he stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Just in case Gwen's parents were home, he moved quietly as he made his way through the house to the exit. Once Gwen finished donning her superhero costume, she looked out the window. She could see Ben down there, turned away from the house and impatiently tapping his foot. So she opened the window and magically lowered herself down. Ben heard her coming and turned to face her. He waited as Lucky Girl approached him. Sorry about that, Gwen said, both for taking so long and for their little argument. It's fine, Ben said, scrolling through his Omnitrix aliens. With XLR8, we'll still be there faster than the fire department. Ben pressed down on the Omnitrix as he finished his sentence, and suddenly he was XLR8 again. Gwen hesitantly took a step forward, raising her arms. What are you doing? Ben asked. Why you supposed to carry me, doofus? Gwen shouted, embarrassed to have to say it out loud. Oh, right. Forgot you're so slow. Shut up. Ben lifted Gwen into his arms. Ready? The blue alien asked. Ready, Gwen confirmed, tightening her grip and preparing for the imminent super speed. Surprisingly, Gwen didn't feel sick or nervous this time. Smiling, she felt the breeze flow through her short red hair, like she was driving in a super-fast convertible. It felt nice and exciting, yet strangely calming too. When she saw the plumes of smoke, she remembered what they'd set out for. Just like last time, Ben stopped down the street from their destination just before the Omnitrix timed out and he reverted back to his human form. Gwen surveyed the situation. The burning building was massive, and flames were clearly visible on just about every floor. The fire had already spread to the adjacent buildings as well, and a large chunk of the building was missing as if it had been blown up. What happened? Gwen asked, expecting Ben to have heard about this from the news. An explosion. The news crews don't know what set it off yet, but they said there are people trapped inside, and a few smaller explosions have gone off too. They also said if the fire trucks don't put the fire out soon, the whole building could collapse. You gonna go heat blast? Try and absorb the fire. Gwen suggested. Yep. And then hopefully the Omnitrix will cooperate and let me change into another alien to carry people out. Oh man, I hope the cameras get some nice shots of me. Ben added. Gwen rolled her eyes. I guess I'll try some water conjuring spells to help with the fire, and I'll try to levitate anyone trapped in the building to safety. Ben nodded. Hero time. He shouted, slamming his hand down on the Omnitrix. But nothing happened. He still had to wait another minute or two before it would be ready again. Gwen smirked. I guess it's up to Lucky Girl to save the day. You can join in whenever you're ready, she said. Ha, ha, very funny. Just go. I'll be there in a minute, Ben said, trying to hide how emasculating this was. Gwen smirked once more, hopped on a magic disc, and flew towards the blazing fire. Woo-hoo! Ben cheered, arms raised triumphantly as he ran through the park. They had decided to head back to the same park they'd stopped at last time. Since it was in the central part of town, it was once again conveniently close by, and it was a decent halfway point between their houses. "Wait, slow down," Gwen yelled as she chased after him, laughing as she said it. "Slow down," Ben said, stopping and turning around to face Gwen as she caught up to him. "We can't slow down, we're superheroes," Ben shouted in an overacting voice. Then he grabbed Gwen by the shoulders, lifted her up just a bit off the ground and spun around, making a whoosh noise. "Hey! Quit it! Put me down, doofus!" Gwen shouted in between fits of laughter. "Okay," Ben said, abruptly dropping Gwen to the ground. Having not been prepared, Gwen immediately lost her balance and fell over, still giggling uncontrollably as she did. Ben fell to the ground next to her and joined in. Their act of heroism had been a complete success. They stopped the fire, no buildings collapsed, and everyone was evacuated safely. After everything that happened, they were in high spirits. After the laughter died down, the two of them just lied there for a few minutes, gazing up at the night sky and taking a moment to recuperate. Then Ben stood up. Standing beside Gwen, he bent down and offered his hand to help her up, which she accepted. They clasped hands and he pulled her to her feet. They began walking back to Gwen's house. On the way, they continued to joke around and recount all the action of their latest heroic act. Once they were about halfway to Gwen's house, Gwen noticed Ben glance at his Omnitrix. It was ready to be used again, but for some reason, Ben didn't use it or say anything about it. He could have gone XLR8 and gotten them both to their respective homes in a few seconds, but he didn't. Gwen thought that was weird, but she didn't say anything about it either. Man, it felt so good going heat blast again. I haven't used a lot of my aliens in Wari too long. I hope I get to be Diamond Head next time, Ben said. Next time? Gwen frowned. This was only the second time they'd done any heroing since they got back to Bellwood, the first time having been 2 months ago. She had to admit, it did feel good to help all those people and be a hero again. But something was nagging her. "We should tell Grandpa," Gwen said. "No," Ben said, stopping in his tracks. "We can't say anything to Grandpa about this. He told me not to use the watch when we got back to Bellwood. I know, but I don't feel right doing this behind his back. Besides, I'm sure he'll understand. You've only used it twice now, and both times you did it to save lives. And he's gonna find out sooner or later. Alien heroes running around town isn't exactly something people won't notice. I'm surprised he didn't hear about it last time," Gwen said. "Doesn't matter," Ben stated. "If he knows I'm using the Omnitrix, he'll just tell me to stop. And I don't wanna stop." Gwen didn't say anything. Even if what they were doing was helping people, she was having very mixed feelings about continuing to do this. "Gwen, please. Promise me you won't tell Grandpa," Ben begged. Gwen was surprised to hear Ben actually say please to her. But she agreed. "Okay. I promise." "Great." Ben smiled. "Race you back to your place. Ready? Go." Ben took off sprinting. "Hey! No fair!" Gwen shouted as she began to chase after him. The next day, Gwen sat at her desk, staring at her phone. Having reconsidered, she once again wanted to tell Grandpa that she and Ben had gotten back into the hero business. "We're not doing anything wrong, so it's not like he'll get mad at us. If it weren't for Grandpa, we wouldn't be able to be heroes in the first place. He's helped us so much, he deserves to know. He might even be willing to help again. But she'd made a promise to Ben. That wasn't something she would break easily. She stood up and walked over to her bed, then collapsed onto it, sighing deeply in frustration. I shouldn't have made that promise. Gwen usually thought things through more carefully before making promises like that. She didn't know what had come over her the other night. And now, she figured she was right the first time. It would be better to just tell Grandpa. Gwen looked at her phone again. Sooner or later, we're gonna end up on the news, if we haven't already. Grandpa's gonna hear about it eventually, he might as well hear it from us. Opening up her contacts, she selected her grandfather's number, and hit the call button. She immediately felt guilty, but tried to ignore the feeling as she waited for her grandfather to pick up. Hello. She heard his voice say. Hey, Grandpa. It's me. Gwen said, trying to sound cheery. Oh hey, Gwen. How are you? I'm doing well, thanks. But, I kinda need to talk to you about something. Ben knew what had happened as soon as he saw Grandpa on his caller ID. He answered the call and held his phone up to his ear. Gwen told you, didn't she? He said. You know, Ben, most people say hello when they answer the phone, was his grandfather's response. Ben sighed and clenched his teeth. Hello, Grandpa. Hello, Ben. Now, before we move on, I just want to let you know that you shouldn't be mad at your cousin. She did the right thing telling me what you two have been doing, he continued in a calm voice. Of course she did. Everything she does is just so perfect. Ben rolled his eyes. Okay. And you know what? I'm not mad at the two of you. I think it's great that you're using your gifts to help people again. When I told you not to use the Omnitrix in Bellwood, I knew from the start that you wouldn't be able to listen to me forever. Heck, I'm surprised you listened to me for this long. Ben blinked. Wait. So, you're not mad? Not even a little. I'm worried, of course. What you're doing is dangerous. But it's what you two did all summer, so I know you can handle yourselves. And I know I couldn't stop you even if I wanted to. Just promise me one thing, Max said. What? Ben asked. Never go off fighting crime, or aliens, or doing anything dangerous like that alone. I want you and Gwen to look out for each other. I know you don't always get along, but you've saved each other's lives more times than I can count. I'd feel a lot better if I knew you two were there to keep each other safe. Okay, Grandpa. Oddly enough, Ben didn't find that promise too hard to make. Good. I'm proud of you, Ben. Let me know if you ever need help with anything. Ben and Max said their goodbyes, and hung up. Well, that went better than expected. But Ben was still a bit mad at Gwen. She promised she wouldn't tell their grandfather anything, and then the very next day, she did exactly that. That little tattletale. Of course she told him. She's always trying to get me in trouble. Ben took his phone back out and called Gwen. After a few rings, Gwen answered. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Hi, Gwen said eventually. What is your problem? Ben said with malice. Gwen sighed. Look, I'm sorry, okay. I just thought it would be better if Grandpa heard it from us instead of the news. Gwen sounded genuinely apologetic. But Ben didn't back down. You said you wouldn't tell him. You promised, Ben reminded her. I know, Gwen began, but Ben cut her off. I mean, really. Did you have to run off and be a little tattletale the first chance you got, you little dweeb? Hey! What difference does it make if I told him anyway? He was totally cool with it. It doesn't matter. You still shouldn't have told him. I already explained to you why I told him. If you can't see that I'm right, then you're an idiot. From there, the fight devolved into the two of them shouting insults into their phones. No debate, no points being made, just a string of freak and loser and moron until Gwen got fed up with it and hung up. Gwen lied in her bed with angry tears in her eyes. Of course Ben would do this. Of course he would ruin this. Why did I ever think this would turn out differently? Part of her felt guilty. She had made a promise to Ben, and she had broken that promise. But Ben completely overreacted. Their grandfather wasn't upset at all. Ben had no reason to yell at her or to be that harsh. But something else about all this upset her even more than that. Why do I even bother? Before last summer, she never would have even considered that she and Ben could possibly get along. But this past year, they both seemed to be trying to get past their differences. She'd seen his noble side, the way he risks life and limb to save people he's never even met. And every now and then they had pleasant moments where they got along just fine, like last night. But Ben always has to screw it up. They start to get along, then Ben pulls some stunt like the prank at Christmas or the phone call today. It's always one step forward, and two steps back. Gwen rolled over and stared at the wall. She was beginning to wonder if she could ever actually get along with Ben. Ben was going through a similar dilemma. But rather than laying in bed, his method of dealing with the situation involved punching his pillow repeatedly. He couldn't even tell who he was really made at. Gwen had broken her promise, but he had to admit to himself that he'd overreacted, embarrassingly so. Like Gwen, Ben had noticed the pattern here. They get along, they fight, they get along again, they fight again. And he couldn't decide who to blame. Gwen could be insufferable and stuck up, but he was usually the one starting the fights. Who am I kidding? It's all my fault. Ben gave up punching his pillow and just let his head fall into it. He leaned to the side and glanced at the Omnitrix. If he went XLR8, he could be at Gwen's house in seconds, and he could apologize to her in person. No. I can't let her win like that. He knew he'd screwed up, but he wasn't the only one. And even though he knew they could probably resolve this, his stubbornly competitive nature once again got the better of him. He wasn't going to apologize again, he decided. Not until she did. May, year 1. Gwen wanted to smack her laptop. Or herself. As she reread what she'd just written, she felt like this was turning into the worst essay of her school career. She found dumb spelling and grammar mistakes every paragraph. It didn't seem to be going anywhere. So much of it felt like filler. She was overusing the same few words and phrases over and over. She couldn't help but regret every sentence she wrote as soon as she finished writing it. Gwen moaned, leaning her face into her hands. Maybe I should just scrap the whole thing. English wasn't usually her best subject. Math and science came much easier to her. But she'd never been this bad at it. A noise from her computer made her jump. Looking at the screen, she saw she was getting a Skype call from Lucy. Gwen smiled weakly. She'd been getting calls and texts from Lucy at the most random times every few weeks since Christmas. Glad to have a break from her essay, she answered it. Good morning, Lucy shouted as soon as she popped up on video. It's the middle of the night, Gwen corrected her dryly. Nope. Lucy held up a finger and wagged it back and forth. It passed midnight a minute ago. So it's technically morning. She giggled at her own little joke. Gwen furrowed her brow, checking the time at the bottom corner of her screen. Oh, shoot. Gwen hadn't realized it was so late. Or early. Or whatever. Why are you calling me so late? Gwen asked. She realized too late that might have come off as rude, but Lucy didn't seem to mind. Why are you up so late? Lucy countered. Fair point, Gwen conceded. Lucy laughed. It said you were online, so I got curious what you were up to, Lucy explained. So, what you doing? Failing my essay, Gwen put it bluntly. Pfft, oh come on. Lucy waved her hand dismissively. From what Ben's told me, you're not the type to fail anything in school. Gwen felt her heart sink. Whoa, Gwen, you all right? Lucy asked. You look a little pale. It's nothing, Gwen said quickly, trying to smile. Her problems with Ben were the last thing she wanted to talk about with Lucy. Lucy rested her thumb and forefinger under her chin and leaned into the camera. She exaggeratedly examined Gwen for a moment. Well, okay. Ooh. One sec. I got something I gotta show you. What? Gwen asked as Lucy hopped out of her chair and ran off screen. Lucy came back a moment later holding up a t-shirt. Check it out. Joel got it for me. She held it in front of the camera for Gwen to see. It had some sort of minimalist superhero mask design on it. What is that? Catwoman? Gwen asked. Lucy giggled. No, silly. It's totally you. Lucy slipped the shirt on over her head. Once it was on, she did a little twirl. Tather. How do I look? Gwen was very confused for a second, then it hit her. She hadn't even recognized her own lucky girl mask. Wait, what? What? Gwen suddenly had a lot of questions. Lucy laughed and started doing superhero poses. The mysterious lucky girl, reappearing twice in the same part of the country. You're pretty big on the internet right now. I have merchandise. And memes. Lucy added. Not to mention the fanfiction. But you might not wanna Google that. Wait, how did you even know I was lucky girl? Gwen asked. How many other cute magic redheads are there in Bellwood? Gwen blushed a little. She still wasn't used to all the compliments Lucy gave her. The only people who'd ever called her things like cute and pretty before had been adult relatives like her father and grandfather. Certainly never anyone her own age. Lucy giggled at her reaction. You know, people are wondering if you're an alien too since you keep getting spotted with Ben's aliens. And I guess people still don't know his aliens are all just one transforming human, huh? Gwen scowled again. Just hearing Ben's name was grating on her mind. Lucy's smile faded into a look of concern. Ben still hasn't apologized, has he? It took Gwen a moment to process that Lucy was referring to the incident on Christmas. No, he did. He did. Even though she was mad at him, she had to give credit where credit was due. She really hadn't expected an apology for that, but she got one from him. So are you guys hanging out again? Lucy asked. We don't hang out, Gwen corrected. We only see each other when our families get together. Or when we're doing hero stuff, Gwen said bitterly. She rubbed her face with her hand, suddenly feeling how tired she was. When she looked back at the screen, she could see Lucy looked very uncomfortable. Sorry, Lucy very rarely didn't look happy, so Gwen knew she'd been making things awkward for her with the way she was talking about Ben. Lucy raised up her hands. No, it's fine, she said. Is your essay due tomorrow? Gwen appreciated the sudden change in subject. No, thankfully. But I was trying to spend more time on it because I just can't get it right for some reason. No, I'm sure it's way better than you think, Lucy said encouragingly. Then she gasped. Ooh. I know. You should send it to me when you're done, she suggested. Gwen raised her eyebrow skeptically. You want to proofread it for me? Yeah. Just to give you a second opinion. Trust me, my English is very good for an alien. Lucy smiled proudly. Gwen chuckled a little at that. It was weird to know she had aliens in her family now. Well, all right. I'll probably finish it tomorrow. Then I can email it to you. Cool. Lucy replied. Alrighty then, talk to ya tomorrow. And remember, if you ever need help with anything, just let me know, okay? Gwen nodded. Thank you, Lucy. Good night. Ben sat on the couch with his homework in his lap. He wasn't really working on it though. He had the news on the TV in front of him. Nothing interesting was on, but he kept hoping there would be some kind of crisis that would warrant the use of his aliens again. With his right hand, he absent-mindedly fiddled with the Omnitrix. It was almost like an itch that needed scratching. He had half a mind to head out into the nearest city and just patrol for crime, even if there wasn't anything specific for him to do. But then he remembered his promise to his grandfather. He wasn't supposed to do that sort of thing alone. I'm not asking Gwen for help. For a lame arcade prize, you sure do love wearing that thing, a voice from behind Ben said. Ben reflexively jolted his hand away from the Omnitrix. He turned to see his father standing behind the couch. Hey, Dad, Ben greeted him, hoping to drop the subject of the Omnitrix. So what exactly is it, anyway? Carl asked, walking around the couch and taking a seat in the nearby armchair. Is it just a watch? Does it actually tell time? Great. Yep. And it, lights up and stuff. That's about it, really, Ben lied. But it's really more of a souvenir, I guess, huh? Yeah, Ben said, smiling. The Omnitrix was certainly the best souvenir he could have ever hoped for. I guess it is. That's great, son. Hey, why don't you tell me a bit about what you, your grandpa, and your cousin got up to on your trip? You still haven't told us much, now that I think about it. From what Ben could tell, his father was simply trying to talk to him a little. However, without even realizing it, he was putting Ben in a tough situation. There was a lot he couldn't say about last summer. Do I lie? Ben shrugged. I dunno. What do you wanna know? He asked, trying to buy time to think. Well, where'd you go? I remember your grandpa had everything all planned out. Lots of cities and monuments and parks to visit, right? Carl tilted his head back as he tried to remember what his father had told him. Yeah, we went to lots of places. Mount Rushmore, DC, Sparksville. Ben recounted. Did you see any aliens? Carl asked. What? What are you talking about? Ben suddenly got very nervous. You know, like the ones on the news. Some have showed up near here recently, too. There were a ton of those incidents last summer. And I think a lot of them were in places you guys visited. Carl stared into space and squinted a little, like he was on the verge of some realization. Oh. Ben thought quickly. He needed a way to distract his father and make him think he had nothing to do with the alien encounters. I got it. Ben scoffed. You kidding? I wish I got to see cool stuff like that. Oh. Carl asked. You didn't see any of them? Nope. Every time we showed up somewhere that had an encounter, we found out we'd just missed the aliens. And then all we got to do was dumb touristy stuff. I bet half those cities made up the aliens to trick tourists, Ben said, sounding very ticked off. Really? Not even once? Seems almost impossible with how much you guys traveled last summer. Well, we would have gotten to see them if it weren't for Gwen, Ben said with disgust. What do you mean? His father asked. Every time we heard of another alien encounter, I asked Grandpa to take us straight there. But Gwen always wanted to stop somewhere along the way, like a famous library or some dumb science museum. Ben lied. Partially lied, anyway. Is that so? Wow, that's quite surprising, Carl said, although he sounded like he thought Ben was exaggerating a lot. Well, that's just how Gwen is. Leave it to her to ruin the summer trip I waited all year for, Ben declared. Sorry to hear that, Sport, Carl said. So, what are you working on there? He asked, indicating the notebook Ben was holding. What? Oh, just some homework, Ben explained. Well, try to get it done tonight. Don't watch too much TV, Ben's father said, getting up and leaving the room. Okay, Ben called after him. That was close. For a minute there, Ben thought his father was going to figure out he was involved with all the alien incidents last summer, but it looked like he'd managed to successfully avoid that once again. However, now that he'd lied about it some more, he felt bad about it. Not just for lying to his father, but he'd also kind of thrown Gwen under the bus. Whatever. Not like she made the summer any better. Ben felt a heavy weight on himself as he had that thought. He looked at his Omnitrix, remembering all the times Gwen had actually come to his rescue. He sighed. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Ben was ticked off. He never understood why his parents had to randomly get together with Gwen's family like this. So as his parents finished setting the dinner table downstairs, Ben stood by the window on the second floor. Maybe she's forgotten about it. He and Gwen still hadn't spoken since their fight last month, so Ben had no idea what his cousin would be thinking tonight. Not that he ever knew what she was thinking. But these family dinners were awkward enough when they weren't in the middle of a fight. It would make things a lot easier if they could just ignore what had happened. Ben ducked to the side when he saw Gwen's car pulling up the driveway. He watched carefully as Gwen stepped out of the back seat and walked toward the house. If she didn't look angry. She looks angry. Ben was very familiar with that face. That was her "I can't believe I have to be here right now" face. Well, that settles that. As far as Ben was concerned, there was zero chance of Gwen apologizing tonight. And that meant zero chance of him apologizing either. Ben sat down at the top of the stairs. He was out of sight of his family downstairs, but he could hear Gwen and her parents come in the front door. His parents greeted them and started talking with Gwen's parents. He listened for Gwen's voice, but didn't hear it. He knew he would have to go downstairs and join them for the awkward family dinner eventually, but he waited until his mother called out to him so he could avoid it as long as humanly possible. When Ben finally joined them, he walked briskly to the table and sat down, keeping his eyes on his food. "Hello, Ben. So nice to see you," his uncle greeted him warmly. "Hello, Ben," his aunt greeted him curtly. "Hello," Ben replied, hoping they'd forget about him and resume their conversation with his parents. Luckily, they seemed to. Their meal continued in much the same way as their last one, except with one crucial difference. The reassuring looks Ben and Gwen usually shared when their mothers got a bit snippy were non-existent this time around, instead being replaced by nervous glances and attempts to avoid eye contact at all costs. Not that their parents noticed the difference. They usually assumed the two of them weren't getting along anyway. "So, Ben, got any plans for the summer?" Gwen's father asked about 20 minutes into the meal. The end of the school year was only about a month away, so Frank thought this would make for decent small talk. Ben looked at him, his face blank with confusion. He glanced over at Gwen and made eye contact with her for the first time since she'd arrived, seeing she had the exact same look on her face. Ben glanced back at his uncle, and then at his own parents. "Aren't we gonna do another trip with Grandpa?" he asked. "Really?" his father asked. Now it was the parents' turn to look confused. "Yeah. Why not?" Ben asked, not understanding. "Well, it's just, from what you've said, it sounded like your last trip wasn't quite everything you were hoping it would be," his mother explained. His father nodded, and so did Gwen's parents. Ben and Gwen figured it out at the same time. Since they couldn't tell their parents they'd been fighting aliens and supervillains all summer, they'd avoided talking about the trip as much as possible all year. And whenever their parents had asked them about it, they'd always deflected the questions by complaining about each other. Ben had said things like, "I thought it would be great, but then the dweeb had to show up and ruin it," and Gwen, too, had said her share of "Have you ever had to share a room with the doofus for 3 months? Not exactly my idea of a vacation." It wasn't that bad," Ben admitted. "Yeah," Gwen chimed in. "There were some fun parts. I wouldn't mind giving it another try." "Well, I don't know," Ben's father spoke. "We haven't discussed it with your grandpa at all. He might not have time to plan out a whole summer trip again." "Please?" Gwen pleaded, realizing immediately that she'd said it way too desperately. It would mean a lot to Grandpa," Ben stepped in. "Yeah," Gwen agreed. "He loved spending the summer with us. I'm sure he could have another trip planned in a day or two if you asked him." Their parents glanced around at each other, shrugging their confusion and nodding their approval. "Well, all right," Gwen's father agreed. "We'll give him a call tomorrow and see if he's up for it." "Thank you," Ben and Gwen said in unison. They shared a glance, their eyes plainly showing their relief. Then they remembered they were still supposed to be in a fight, and looked away in embarrassment. June, Year 1. Gwen had never seen a more perfect summer day. The sun was shining without a cloud in the sky. It was warm, but with a gentle breeze. She sat on the curb beside Ben, eating a strawberry ice cream cone while Ben enjoyed a chocolate one. They chatted about nothing in particular, but everything seemed funny for some reason. The crisp, summer air was filled with the sounds of their pleasant laughter. Unexpectedly, Gwen heard a faint beeping sound. Confused, she looked around, trying to find its source. Ben was continued to talk to her, still happily eating his ice cream, not reacting to what she was doing at all. The beeping got a little louder. "Ben, what's that sound?" Gwen asked. "What?" Ben still seemed unfazed. "Oh, it's nothing." He took another lick of his ice cream. "What do you mean it's?" Suddenly, everything shifted. In an instant, most of Ben's ice cream had disappeared, and he took the last bite. The beeping was much louder and more frequent. Gwen looked at the Omnitrix and saw it blinking red like an alarm. "Ben, the watch!" Gwen shouted. "Don't worry about it," Ben said in a laid-back tone. He stood up and stretched, his arm bending with the Omnitrix right next to his ear. It was like he couldn't even hear it. He started walking down the sidewalk away from Gwen. The beeping was almost deafening now. Even as Ben moved farther away from Gwen, it sounded like the Omnitrix was right next to her. "Ben!" Gwen stood up. "Ben, you're in danger." She tried to follow him, but the sidewalk morphed before her. It stretched out, moving Ben and Gwen farther from each other. "Ben!" Gwen shouted over the beeping. "Ben, please. You need to do something. You need to get help." Ben stopped walking and turned back around to look at her. He smiled, lifting his left hand and waving. He seemed completely oblivious to the urgency in Gwen's shouting. Gwen watched the blinking red light on the Omnitrix blink faster and faster. Eventually it emitted one continuous beep, and the Omnitrix exploded. Gwen woke up. "Ben!" She looked around the room frantically, hyperventilating and in a cold sweat. She saw only the darkness of her bedroom, partially illuminated by the moonlight streaming through her cracked window. Finally realizing it was just a dream, she pulled her legs in and wrapped her arms around them, curling up into a ball and pressing her face into her knees. She began to cry. She knew what that dream was about. This wasn't the first time she'd had it. She'd had similar dreams almost every night for about a week after one of their last adventures of their first summer trip. The way she felt in the dream was exactly how she'd felt for several days straight while the Omnitrix's self-destruct sequence was active. They'd come so close to losing him, and there was so little she could do the whole time. It was the scariest, most stressful experience of her short life. And she'd put on a tough exterior throughout the entire ordeal, acting like she wasn't worried in the slightest. It was exhausting. So she cried. She took all the stress and frustration she'd bottled up back then and finally let it out. She didn't care about her dumb fight with Ben anymore. It was pointless compared to everything they'd been through together. The next day, Ben and Gwen were loading their stuff into the rust bucket, which was parked in front of Ben's house. Their parents and their grandfather stood on the front lawn discussing Max's plans for the summer. As Ben moved his stuff on board, he saw Gwen was completely stone-faced. She wasn't looking at him or talking to him at all either. At this point, it had been a few months since they'd had their fight. Ben was ready to just forget it entirely, but judging from the way Gwen was acting, he figured she was still mad at him. So, he said nothing to her either, taking it as another challenge. After talking for a little bit, Ben's parents invited Gwen's parents and Max inside for some coffee before Max hit the road. Ben watched them follow his parents into the house. As soon as they were out of sight, Gwen practically tackled him with a hug. "Hey!" What Ben was startled, and at first he thought she was attacking him. Then he saw the way she pressed her face into his shoulder. He let her stay there for a few seconds until she pulled away and walked off. She simply grabbed another bag to bring into the rust bucket, going back to avoiding him like she'd been a moment ago. What was that for? Ben asked, sounding confused rather than angry. Shut up, Gwen said, but there wasn't any real anger in her voice. Ben also heard her sniffle, but he figured it was just allergies or something. Ben was too dumbfounded to move for a moment. He watched Gwen climb the steps into the rust bucket, holding some of his luggage in front of him. What was that? When Gwen came back outside, Ben didn't know what to do. He was about to ask her about it again, but she didn't seem very approachable at the moment. And is she mad at me now or something? Ben shook his head, deciding to ignore his cousin's strange behavior for now. He went back to loading his belongings into the rust bucket. 10 minutes later, after everyone had said their goodbyes, the rust bucket pulled away from Ben's house. Their second summer had officially begun. With Max driving, Ben was lounging in his seat at the table, ready to relax for a while. But then he felt a tug on his sleeve. Hey, he began to complain, but saw Gwen holding her finger up to her lips, signaling for him to be quiet. She pulled on his sleeve again and he stood up. She led him into their room in the back of the rust bucket and shut the door. What do you want? Ben asked cautiously, not sure why she was being so secretive. Gwen looked worried about something, like she was about to break some bad news to him. I need you to do something for me. Gwen sounded serious. Ben stared at her. She seemed to have his full attention, so she continued. This summer, could you just be a little more careful? Please? Gwen's voice implied nothing but genuine concern. Ben appeared to be thinking about it for a few moments. All of this had caught him completely off guard. Less than half an hour ago, he thought Gwen was still mad at him. But then there was that hug, and now this. I'll never understand how this girl's mind works. I'll. Ben struggled to find a response. I'll try, he said uncertainly. Ever so slightly, Gwen's lips curled into a grateful little smile. She nodded without saying anything. Ben suddenly reached out and flicked Gwen's forehead with his finger. Ow. Hey. Gwen complained. Doesn't mean I gotta be careful with you, though. After making that declaration, Ben turned and left the room. Gwen glared at the back of his head as he walked away. She sighed, her expression softening into a smile. It's good to be back. A few days into their second summer trip, Max was up front driving the rust bucket, while his grandkids were sitting further back. As he drove, he listened to the two of them bicker. You are so wrong. No, you are. I'm not. R2. I'm not. R2. Max sighed. I guess some things never change. They were like this all last summer, and they'd been at it again this summer as soon as they were on the road, as far as Max could tell. Max wasn't even sure what their latest argument was about, although it would be generous to call it an argument as it was mostly just contradiction at this point. But he got a little worried when Gwen stormed away from Ben and joined him at the front of the rust bucket, sitting in the passenger seat to his right. Oh boy. She's probably upset. Being careful not to take his eyes off the road for too long, Max glanced over at Gwen. He was surprised by what he saw. He'd been expecting her to be scowling with that "I'm going to kill my cousin" look in her eyes. Instead, she was smiling. She stretched and laid back in her seat, getting comfortable. She looked much more relaxed than she had when Max had come to pick her and Ben up for the trip. He still wondered exactly why she seemed so tense at the time. After returning his attention to the road, Max chanced another distraction and looked in the rear-view mirror to check on Ben. He was lounging at the table playing video games. He looked like he was having fun too. Nothing at all suggested he'd just had a fight with his cousin. "Everything all right, Pumpkin?" Max asked Gwen, slightly puzzled. Gwen nodded in the affirmative, still smiling contentedly. "You sure? It sounded like you and Ben were really going at it a moment ago," Max said. Gwen turned, head tilted and eyebrow raised in confusion. She looked back towards Ben, then back at her grandfather. "What, that? It's no big," she said, shrugging it off. She pulled out a book and started reading. Max stared at the road ahead of him. "I'll never understand these kids." It was a little less than a week before Ben, Gwen, and Max had their first alien encounter of the summer. They'd been driving over a bridge into the city they were planning to visit next. A huge traffic jam came out of nowhere, bringing them to a halt. Max figured it was just bad traffic, but then he saw smoke on the other end of the bridge. It wasn't long before people fleeing on foot started running by. "What's going on, Grandpa?" Gwen asked, noticing the commotion as well. "I'm not sure." "We'd better check it out," Max replied. Gwen glanced at Ben. He was smiling, excited. He'd been looking forward to this. He'd only had 2 good chances to go hero in the past year, and it just hadn't been enough for him. Gwen gave him a nervous look, hoping to non-verbally remind him of his promise to be careful. The 3 of them exited the rust bucket together. Max managed to stop somebody who was running away long enough to discover there were 2 large orange monsters rampaging across the bridge. There were about 100 aliens that could fit that description, so they decided to make their way through the pileup of cars and check it out for themselves. They knew they were getting closer when the screams and other chaotic noises got louder. Gwen climbed on top of a car and hopped up onto an overturned bus to get a better view. She got a good look at the aliens. 2 giant Vulpimancers, roaring and tossing cars out of the way as they ran around like wild animals. "Wild mutts!" Gwen shouted to Ben and Grandpa. Ben was struggling to make it onto the bus that Gwen was standing on. She reached out her hand to help pull him up. He took it. On top of the bus, Ben took a look at the aliens. He smirked with that cocky smile Gwen had grown so used to seeing. "Hey, I'll show these fleabags a wild mutt." He adjusted the dial on the Omnitrix. Once Wild Mutt was selected, he held up his hand, ready to bring it down. Before he did, he turned to Gwen. She didn't look as excited as he felt, but he spoke to her nonetheless. "You ready, dweeb?" Gwen sighed. "More ready than you'll ever be, doofus," Gwen said. She raised her hands and a magical bluish glow surrounded them. Just before they leapt into action, Ben slammed his hand down on the Omnitrix. "It's hero time." July, Year 1. Ben awoke feeling very comfortable. He didn't really understand why, but sleeping in the rust bucket felt even better than sleeping in his bed at home. From beneath him, he heard the gentle sounds of Gwen's breathing as she slept. That's definitely something he didn't have at home. Ben thought back to their first few nights in the rust bucket together. Hearing any noise from Gwen at all was like nails on a chalkboard to him back then. Now, it didn't bother him at all. He actually found it rather soothing to hear her. He hadn't realized it at the time, but Ben had trouble getting to sleep his first few nights back home after their first summer trip, likely due to the absence of these now familiar surroundings. It wasn't often that Ben woke up before Gwen did, but he knew from past experiences that it would wake her up if he were to climb down from the top bunk. Deciding to be nice for a change, Ben lay in bed for a bit longer instead of getting up immediately. He thought about how this summer had been going. So far, it had been everything he'd hoped for. The adventure, the aliens, the heroing. Just yesterday, they'd fought some giant mutant alligator monsters in the Everglades. Before that, they'd been in Atlanta where they evicted some alien fish that had been swimming around in the cola vats of a soda bottling plant, which definitely would have been bad news for Ben and his fellow soda drinkers of the world. And before that, they'd run into a group of tetramans who were huge fans of forearms, leading to one hell of an arm wrestling competition. They had an encounter with some rogue magicians too, and Gwen got to use Characaster's spellbook against them. So much had happened so quickly, and Ben was loving every minute of it. This past month, Ben hadn't really felt angry anymore. It had been a long time since his last forced guidance counselor appointment, but even with all of those, he'd still spent a good deal of the last year being angry. And when he wasn't angry, he was stressed or, more commonly, just plain bored. But not anymore. Setting foot in the rust bucket again had just melted all of his anger and boredom away. He was in his element, and he was finally having fun again. Even fighting with Gwen on a regular basis again seemed to put him at ease. The two of them took every opportunity they could to try out new ways of calling each other names. They never held back on calling the other out when they were being stubborn or irritating. And the practical jokes never stopped. Max had been stepping in to stop them from fighting less and less. He often heard them trading insults, then looked to see they were smiling as they did so. It confused him, but he found it amusing. He even surprised the two of them a few times by laughing at some of their more clever insults. Ben smiled contentedly as he relaxed in the top bunk. Everything was finally right with the world again. He drifted back to sleep. Later in the day, everyone was up. Max was driving, Ben was sitting in the passenger seat, and Gwen was sitting by the table reading a book. "So Ben, you still having trouble getting the Omnitrix to listen to you?" Max asked Ben all of a sudden. Ben looked at him a little confused. "I've kinda gotten the hang of it. It still does whatever it wants now and then though." "Why?" "Well, that last encounter in the Everglades, I thought for sure you were going to use Wildvine, but you changed into Cannonbolt instead," Max explained. Gwen, overhearing their conversation, shuddered at the mention of Wildvine. When they'd gone to the planet Xenon last year to look for Azimuth, she'd almost been eaten by one of the Florauna that had infested Azimuth's base. Ben seemed to have gotten nervous too. Stumbling over his words, he managed to stutter out a lame explanation for why he chose Cannonbolt instead. He glanced at Gwen, but quickly turned away again and looked at the floor, his face turning red like he was ashamed of something. "What's that about?" Gwen could tell he was obviously acting weird for some reason. She thought about it for a second. Between all their adventures so far this summer, plus the two they'd had during the year, she'd seen Ben use most of his aliens. She listed them in her head, and counted 17. He'd used all the aliens he had in the Omnitrix except two, way big, which was usually wildly impractical, and Wildvine. That's weird. It's like he's not using it on purpose. The way Ben reacted to their grandfather asking him about it made it all the stranger. Is it because? Gwen wondered if Ben had been avoiding Wildvine for her benefit. Maybe he didn't want to force her to remember her near-death experience. Or maybe he hated being reminded of the monsters that he thought had killed his cousin. Gwen thought back to when the two of them had been reunited after Gluto had saved her from the Florauna. Right in the middle of a war zone, Ben had run up to her and hugged her tight, crying tears of joy into her shoulder. She hadn't really had time to process his reaction at the time. They'd been separated for quite a while at the point, and that whole time he had to have thought she was dead. That must have been awful for him. Gwen stared at the back of Ben's head with a look of sympathy on her face. As if sensing her gaze, Ben turned to look at her. They made eye contact. Gwen smiled reassuringly, trying to tell him it's okay. Ben returned a wary smile, although Gwen couldn't be sure if he got the message or not. The sound of Ben's laughter caused Gwen to look up from her laptop. He was watching something on his phone with his earbuds in. Ordinarily, Gwen would have found this annoying, but today she was just curious about what he was watching. "What's so funny?" Gwen asked. Ben glanced up from his phone. He barely heard her, so he pulled his earbuds out. "You gotta check this out." Ben stood up and slid out of the booth, coming around the table to slide in next to Gwen. "Hey!" Gwen complained. "Scoot over," Ben said when he bumped into her. Gwen acquiesced, moving over to let Ben in on her side of the table. She thought he'd show her his phone, but instead he put his hands on her laptop's keyboard and started typing. "Why yes, Ben. You may borrow my laptop," Gwen said sarcastically, a little annoyed he did so without asking. "Whatever, dweeb. Here, look." Ben had pulled up a video. Apparently, during one of his last hero outings, a bystander had managed to capture some footage of Diamond Head easily beating up some smaller aliens, confidently cracking jokes as he did. Now the video was going viral. "Isn't that awesome?" Ben asked. Gwen smirked. "You just had to spout those lame action movie one-liners, didn't you? All the Diamond Head fans are loving it. He's one of my most popular aliens right now. Oh man, I definitely need to use him again next time we fight crime in Bellwood." Gwen furrowed her brow. "Why?" "Because I want all the cool aliens to get spotted in our town. It'll make it so much less boring if our town was famous for being an alien hero hangout," Ben explained. Gwen laughed. "You trying to make us the next Roswell?" "Yeah, but like, with superheroes." Ben seemed rather happy, but since he'd brought up their heroing in Bellwood, it reminded Gwen of something. "I never apologized." Back when she'd told their grandfather that they were using the Omnitrix and her magic to fight crime again, Ben had said some pretty mean things to her. She was long over it though. Now she just felt bad for her part in it. She'd broken her promise, and that wasn't something to gloss over. Ben didn't seem to mind at all. So far, they'd been getting along surprisingly well this trip. But if he was so willing to forgive her, then that was all the more reason she felt she should apologize. Gwen tapped Ben on the shoulder. "Home?" he asked, looking up from the computer screen. Gwen glanced at their grandfather, who was up front driving. Then she pointed to their bedroom, indicating that she'd rather talk in private. Ben looked confused, not knowing what this was about. But he nodded nonetheless, sliding out of the booth. Gwen followed him. Together, they walked to their room and shut the door behind them. "What is it?" Ben asked, wondering what she wanted to hide from Maximum. Standing in front of Ben in the middle of the room, Gwen nervously rubbed her hands together. It was kind of awkward to give an apology so long after the fact, but if Ben could do it, so could she. "Remember that time you played a prank on me at Christmas? And, well, you were nice enough to apologize for it later. So, I guess now I owe you an apology," she admitted. Ben still seemed confused. "For what?" Gwen took a deep breath. I'm sorry I told Grandpa that we were doing hero stuff in Bellwood. I shouldn't have done that, she said. Well, I mean, I should have told Grandpa, since it was the right thing to do. But I shouldn't have promised not to, and then broken that promise. That was wrong. Do you know what I mean? Gwen realized she was over-explaining and rambling. Yeah, I get it, Ben said, holding up his hands. And, you know, it's fine. It's no big deal. Gwen nodded. She could tell Ben was finding this as awkward as she did, but she was relieved to get that off her chest and to know he'd forgiven her. Even? Gwen asked. Even, Ben agreed. Gwen nodded again. Okay. Good. Great. She smiled and walked to the door. Ben followed Gwen back into the Rust Bucket's main area. They sat back down at the table. Gwen went back to her laptop and Ben went back to his phone without another word to each other. As he browsed the internet, Ben occasionally stole glances at Gwen. It felt strange for Gwen to pull him away for a serious talk like that and then just act like nothing happened. But Gwen's apology stayed on Ben's mind. Something different about her. While the two of them weren't at each other's throats 100% of the time last summer, they definitely fought a lot more back then than they did now. Even the fights they'd had recently weren't even real fights. And while getting a random hug or an apology from Gwen wasn't completely new either, something definitely seemed different about Gwen's overall attitude towards him. Hey Gwen, Ben said, getting her attention. Gwen looked at him cautiously, worried her apology might have opened old wounds or something. When we get to the next city, what do you wanna do first? Ben asked. Gwen seemed suspicious. What do you mean? I don't know. Like, a museum. Or, you know, something like that. You're letting me choose what we do first. Yeah, I guess. You never let me choose. Look, do you wanna pick something or not? Ben asked, a little annoyed. Gwen smiled. Well. She got up and came around to Ben's side of the table, pulling her laptop over with her. She pulled up the city's tourism site. They actually have a really cool-looking science museum. It has an IMAX theater, a space shuttle flight simulator, and this season they have an exhibit on ancient Egypt. Oh my god. Ben chuckled quietly as Gwen launched into her nerdy spiel, resting his chin on his hand to watch her computer screen. This ought to be good. August, year 1. It was a lazy Sunday. Max had gone out to get some supplies, leaving Ben and Gwen alone in the Rust Bucket. The two of them sat in the booth around the table in the motorhome's midsection. Gwen was reading yet another book, while Ben was playing a video game on a handheld console. Days like this weren't exciting like the days they got to fight aliens and supervillains, but Ben and Gwen still enjoyed them. Gwen certainly enjoyed them more than Ben did though. It was relaxing to just be able to sit around and do whatever they felt like, not having to worry about anything. And not that they ever said anything about it, but they enjoyed just hanging out together too. In fact, they'd recently started sitting together on the same side of the booth, even when their grandfather wasn't there and they could have each taken a side for themselves. Neither said a word about it, they just started doing so one day and it just sort of stuck. As Gwen leafed through her book, she suddenly felt Ben pushing his back into her side, like she was the back of a sofa chair. He was using her to prop himself up as he leaned back to play his video game. Excuse me. Just what the heck do you think you're doing? Gwen asked, mildly irritated. Ben laughed. You make a good backrest, he said, not moving from his position at all. Gwen sighed and went back to reading. After a minute, Ben interrupted her again. That's it. What's it? Gwen asked. I didn't think you'd actually let me lean on you like this, I mean, Ben explained. Gwen blushed. She realized she'd given in too easily. Do you want to move? She asked. Well, Ben thought for a second. He wiggled around a bit, getting more comfortable. It's actually pretty comfy, he said. Whatever was all Gwen said. It wasn't actually that bothersome. She could tell Ben wanted her to fight him over this or something, but she wasn't really in the mood to get competitive with him. They continued to read and play games in that position for a while, as if it were no different from how they'd been sitting beforehand. As she read, Gwen started feeling a little thirsty. She considered getting up to get a glass of water, but she knew that would force Ben to give up his backrest. For some reason that made her decide not to get up. Likewise, Ben was getting kinda hungry. He wanted to get up to go get a snack, but he was too comfortable to move. After a while of this, they both started to get tired. Ben turned off his game and put it down on the table. He blinked a few times, his eyelids feeling heavy. Maybe I'll just. Ben twisted his body a little so he could lie down. Without even thinking about what he was doing, his head ended up resting in Gwen's lap. He vaguely noticed, but he was feeling too sleepy for it to really register with him. Gwen was still absorbed in her book, so she didn't really notice Ben's shift of position either. She did feel relieved to have the extra weight mostly off of her, and used the opportunity to stretch a bit as she read. Unconsciously, Gwen put her hand on Ben's head and started slowly running her hand through his hair. It felt like petting a cat, something Gwen hadn't done in a long time. After a moment, she realized what she was actually doing. Embarrassed for herself, she pulled her hand back, hovering it up in the air as she looked down. Ben had fallen asleep. She was about to shake him awake and tell him to quit invading her personal space, but she decided she didn't want to disturb him while he slept. He's been in danger a lot lately. He needs his rest. Despite constantly putting himself in harm's way yet again this summer, Gwen noticed he'd also been fulfilling his promise to be careful at the same time. He'd gotten a lot better at accepting her help when fighting a bad guy. He was willing to step back and let the police handle smaller matters, and he actually listened when she made a plan for them. So Gwen felt he deserved a little extra consideration. She went back to reading, and after a short while, she started stroking Ben's hair unconsciously again. But this time, she didn't stop herself when she realized it. It was soothing to her for some reason. Before long, she was drifting off to sleep too. Guess I need this too. The sound of a door slamming open woke them both up some time later. Grandpa's home. As fast as he could, Ben sat up and scooted away from Gwen. Gwen scooted away from him too, grabbing her book so she could pretend she was reading it. As they pretended to be busy, they faced away from each other, red in the face and wide awake despite having just been asleep. I'm back. Max greeted them jovially as he carried the supplies inside. Hey, Grandpa, Ben said, his voice cracking. Welcome back. Gwen said, her tone not matching the look on her face in the slightest. They were trying to act natural when they responded, but inside they were freaking out. Max finished putting the supplies away, then got a good look at his grandkids for the first time since stepping inside the rust bucket. Is everything all right, kids? Max asked. Something was clearly going on. Totally. We're fine. Ben kept his eyes on his game and Gwen didn't look away from her book. Max studied them for a moment. Their behavior was undoubtedly strange, but he thought he knew what the cause of it was. Guess they were fighting again. Must have been pretty serious this time. Max felt he should say something, but seeing as they seemed to be handling things in their own way, he decided to leave them be this time. He yawned, stretching his arms. Well, it's been a long day. I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late, now. Okay. Night, Grandpa. Max furrowed his brow at their stiff responses. He shook his head as he walked away. Even after Max had left the room, Ben and Gwen continued to pretend to be busy. Gwen thought back to the time she and Ben had fallen asleep together on her bed. It would have been embarrassing, but she lucked out since she woke up first and neither Ben nor their parents noticed what had happened. This time was different though. Max didn't seem to have noticed, but she and Ben had woken up at the same time. He knows. He'd lied down in her lap, and she'd let him, and they'd fallen asleep like that. Together. This was a million times worse than last time. I think I'm gonna go to bed too, Gwen said in a quiet voice. She stood up and managed to force herself to look at Ben for the first time since they'd woken up. At least he looks as embarrassed as I feel. Okay. Night, Ben said, turning to glance at her for a second before averting his eyes again. He felt like going to bed for the night too, but he decided to wait a little bit. The two of them needed some space for a bit. What the hell was I thinking? Ben scolded himself for lying on Gwen in the first place. Neither of them could remember the last time they'd felt this awkward around each other. The next morning, Gwen awoke before Ben did, as usual. She'd been having a rather pleasant dream, so she was in a good mood when she opened her eyes. But as she stared up at the bunk bed above her, memories of last night came flooding back to her. Oh! Gwen covered her face with her hands and groaned quietly to herself, cringing at the thought of her and Ben falling asleep on each other. Again. That was gonna take some time to forget. After a moment of self-pity, Gwen sat up and stepped out of bed. As she tiptoed across the small room to the door, she heard a snore from behind her. She tensed up and turned around. Ben was still asleep. Gwen wondered what he'd say when he woke up. Is he going to care? In the main room of the Rust Bucket, Gwen found that Max was already awake. Good morning, sleepyhead, Max greeted his granddaughter. Good morning, Grandpa, Gwen said politely. I was just about to make some breakfast. Max took a cooking pan out of the cupboard and placed it on the counter next to a bowl filled with wriggling somethings. No thank you. I'll just have some cereal. Gwen grimaced, eager to avoid more of her grandfather's cooking. Okay, then. More for me, Max said obliviously. After pouring milk into her cereal bowl, Gwen took her seat at the table and began to peruse the internet on her laptop as she ate. For a while, the only sounds in the room were Gwen's chewing and Max's humming as he cooked. Gwen froze mid-chew when the bedroom door opened and Ben wandered out. His eyelids were half shut and his bedhead was even worse than usual. Gwen's eyes followed him cautiously as he walked across the floor. Well, good morning, Ben, Max greeted him warmly. Morning, Ben mumbled, still half asleep. Want some? Max offered, gesturing to the food he was making. Ben shook his head, apparently awake enough to know that was a bad idea. Instead, he grabbed a bowl of cereal like Gwen did and went to sit down across from her. Gwen was nervous, but Ben didn't seem to mind her presence at all. "Hey," Gwen said to test the waters. Millimeter Ben grunted in response, chewing his cereal. Gwen furrowed her brow. Does he not even remember? While Gwen had been worried that things would be weird between them after last night, Ben didn't seem to be bothered by it at all. She wasn't quite sure what to make of this. Maybe he's just not fully awake yet. Ben was definitely still tired. She decided to wait until after breakfast to speak to him again. If he was going to freak out like she was, he'd do it when he could formulate complete thoughts. So the two of them sat across from each other, eating in silence. Gwen pretended to be focused on her laptop screen, but all she was doing was scrolling up and down. The sound of a large bowl being placed on the table beside them caused them both to flinch in surprise. "Sure you don't want any?" Max offered again, showing them a bowl filled with disgusting colors and more signs of life than there should be in food. "You, gross," Ben said, retreating to the far end of the booth. Gwen coughed and covered her nose. No thanks, we're good." "Really?" Max shrugged. "Suit yourselves." He walked away, taking the bowl with him. Ben and Gwen shared a look. That was a close one. Then they laughed in relief. "We gotta buy more cereal on the way back today," Ben said quietly. "Totally," Gwen agreed. Ben nodded. "What are you looking at?" Ben asked, pointing to Gwen's laptop with his spoon. "More museum stuff." Yeah. Just planning out the day," Gwen said, quickly opening up the museum webpage she'd showed him last night. "Cool," Ben said, lifting his bowl to his lips to drink the remaining milk. "He really doesn't care." Gwen breathed a sigh of relief. She was just being paranoid after all. The embarrassing moment from last night was long past, and Ben wasn't dwelling on it. It seemed she had no reason to either. Ben laughed. "You're that excited, huh?" "What?" Gwen asked, worried that her expression was giving away too much. "Whatever, it's cool. I know you enjoy your nerd stuff," dweeb Ben said. Gwen felt another wave of relief. He was just talking about the museum. As far as Gwen was concerned, they were still on good terms like they had been before the incident last night. She reflected on how different this outcome seemed compared to last year. If the same thing had happened then, they probably would have spent all night yelling at each other, and then not said a word to each other the next day. But now, it was no big deal. Things were good between them. And with the summer coming to a close in just a few weeks, it was starting to look like it might stay that way, perhaps even lasting into the school year. Gwen smiled to herself. "I hope so. And that the ending of this part everyone. Hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel, and also tell me your recommendation in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching.